Carl Jung on empath identity, 10 ways empaths lose themselves and disappear inside the people they love. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about people who feel everything and lose themselves completely in the process. What modern culture celebrates as being an empath is, according to Jungian psychology, often a catastrophic failure of individuation, a severe boundary dissolution that Jung would recognize not as a spiritual gift, but as a developmental arrest disguised as sensitivity. Jung never used the term empath, but he extensively documented this exact condition under different names: participation, mystique, psychic infection, and most critically, the complete sacrifice of the self to avoid the terror of one's own shadow. Here's the forbidden truth that no one in the spiritual community wants to hear. Most self-identified empaths aren't experiencing heightened consciousness. They're enacting a trauma response where absorbing others' emotions becomes a defense mechanism against facing their own inner void, their own darkness, their own unlived life. This isn't sensitivity, it's psychological porosity. Jung called it the dissolution of consciousness, a pre-individuated state where ego boundaries never properly formed, making it impossible to distinguish where you end and others begin. You walk into a room and immediately become the dominant emotional field. You meet someone struggling, and within hours you're carrying their depression as if it were your own. You fall in love, and 6 months later, you can't remember your own preferences, your own voice, your own story. You've disappeared, not metaphorically, literally disappeared into another person's psychological reality. And everyone calls this being compassionate. Everyone celebrates this as deep sensitivity. Everyone tells you, this is a gift. But Jung would tell you something very different. He would tell you that what you're experiencing is catastrophic ego weakness, combined with compensatory inflation of the feeling function. That your boundaries never solidified during development, often due to childhood emotional enmeshment, narcissistic parenting, or early trauma, leaving you in a state of perpetual psychological merger with your environment. This is why empaths report feeling drained after social interaction, why they need hours of solitude to recharge, why intimate relationships feel simultaneously like coming home and like dying. Because on a psychological level, you are dying. Your sense of separate selfhood is being annihilated through merger. Jung observed this phenomenon most clearly in his early clinical work. Patients who exhibited what he called psychic contagion, the unconscious transmission and absorption of psychological content between individuals. He noticed that certain people seemed to have no psychological immune system, no filter between their inner world and the external environment, no capacity to say, "This feeling is not mine. This pain belongs to someone else." Instead, they absorbed everything, became everything, disappeared into everything, and they suffered immensely for it. Not because they were too sensitive for this world, but because they had never developed the fundamental psychological structure required for autonomous existence, a differentiated ego capable of maintaining its own boundaries. In Jungian terms, these individuals remain trapped in the collective unconscious, the undifferentiated psychic soup where no distinction exists between self and other, subject and object, internal and external. It's the psychological state of an infant, of primitive consciousness, of the human psyche before individuation begins. And here's what makes this truly dangerous. Our culture has romanticized this developmental arrest, has turned it into an identity, has created an entire industry around empath gifts and highly sensitive people and energy protection techniques, all of which reinforce the very problem they claim to solve. Because the solution isn't learning better energetic boundaries or shielding techniques or aura cleansing. The solution is something far more radical and far more painful. Developing an actual ego. Building psychological boundaries through the excruciating work of individuation. Learning to exist as a separate self, even when every cell in your body screams that separation equals death. Jung understood this because he lived it. During his own descent into the unconscious, the period documented in the Red Book, Jung experienced terrifying episodes of boundary dissolution. Moments where he couldn't distinguish between his internal visions and external reality, where archetypal figures seemed more real than actual people, where his consciousness threatened to dissolve entirely into the collective unconscious. He survived only because he had already developed a strong ego through his early life and medical training. Even then, he barely made it through. He wrote extensively about how close he came to complete psychosis, to losing himself entirely in the archetypal depths. And he emerged with a clear warning. Opening to the transpersonal without first strengthening the ego is not spiritual advancement. It's psychological suicide. The empath's journey into others' emotional worlds, their capacity to feel everything, their boundary-less sensitivity, all of this represents not evolved consciousness, but arrested development. You're not more spiritual than others. You're more wounded. You're not gifted with special perception. You're burdened with psychological porosity that developed as a survival adaptation to an environment where maintaining boundaries meant abandonment or punishment. Most empaths trace their gift back to childhood, to a moment when emotional attunement to an unstable parent became necessary for survival. When reading mom's moods or dad's anger or the family's unspoken tensions meant the difference between safety and danger, you learned to disappear yourself, to navigate their emotional storms, to become whatever they needed you to be, to regulate their emotions because no one was regulating yours. And that survival strategy, brilliant and necessary in childhood, has now become your prison in adulthood, because you never learned to exist as a separate person, never developed the psychological musculature required to say, I am here, you are there, and there's space between us. Instead, you remain trapped in what Jung called participation mystique, a term he borrowed from anthropology to describe the primitive state where subject and object are merged, where no clear boundaries exist between self and world. In tribal cultures, this manifests as the belief that the individual and their environment are mystically united, that what happens to the corn crop happens to the person, that killing an animal means absorbing its spirit. In modern empaths, it manifests as the inability to distinguish between your emotions and others' emotions, your needs and others' needs, your pain and others' pain. You are psychologically fused with everyone around you, and this fusion feels like love, like connection, like proof of your depth and sensitivity. But Jung would tell you it's actually the opposite. Real love requires two whole individuals. Real connection emerges from the meeting of two differentiated selves. Real compassion flows from fullness, not from the desperate need to merge because you can't tolerate your own separate existence. What you're experiencing as empath gifts is actually a developmental trauma response, a psychological compensation for early boundary violations, a defense mechanism against the unbearable terror of your own inner void. And until you face this truth, you will continue to lose yourself in every relationship, every friendship, every interaction. You will continue to disappear into the people you love, convinced that your self-sacrifice proves your devotion. You will continue to suffer from chronic exhaustion, decision paralysis, identity confusion, and the haunting sensation that you're living someone else's life. Because you are. You've never actually lived your own life. You've been too busy living everyone else's. This video reveals the 10 specific mechanisms through which empaths lose themselves and disappear into others. More importantly, it offers Jung's radical path to reclaiming your lost self, not by becoming cold or disconnected or narcissistic, but by achieving true individuation, by developing the capacity for what Jung called differentiated empathy, the ability to be deeply present to others' pain without absorbing it, to love without merging, to connect without dissolving. This is the empath's true journey, from pathological fusion to psychological differentiation, from self-abandonment to self-possession, from unconscious dissolution to conscious wholeness. It's the most difficult journey you'll ever undertake, because it requires betraying every instinct you've developed for survival. It demands that you disappoint others, tolerate their discomfort, and prioritize your own needs, even when the guilt feels unbearable. It asks you to become, for the first time in your life, a separate person, and that separation will feel like death. But on the other side of that death lies something you've never experienced, the possibility of genuine connection emerging not from desperation and merger, but from two whole individuals choosing to remain distinct while deeply relating. Jung called this the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of two individuated selves. But you can't achieve it until you stop dissolving into everyone you meet. You can't experience real love until you exist as a real person. And you can't be an individuated self until you retrieve all the pieces of yourself that you've scattered across everyone else's psychological landscape. This is your invitation to that retrieval, to that reclamation, to that terrifying and essential journey home to your own abandoned self. Let's begin by understanding exactly how empaths lose themselves and what Jung would say about the mechanisms of disappearance. Jung's concept of participation mystique explains everything about the empath's suffering. It's the term he used to describe a primitive psychological state where no clear distinction exists between subject and object, between self and other, between your inner world and the external environment. In this state, you don't just perceive others' emotions, you become them. You don't just witness others' pain, you absorb it as your own. You don't just understand others' perspectives, you lose your own in the process. This isn't mystical sensitivity, it's psychological porosity resulting from incomplete ego formation. Jung first observed this phenomenon in his early clinical work at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital. He noticed that certain patients seemed to have no psychological immune system. They absorbed the moods, symptoms, and even physical ailments of people around them. One patient would enter the hospital relatively stable. After a week near a severely depressed patient, they would develop identical symptoms, the same slowed movements, the same thought patterns, the same death wishes, despite having no prior history of depression. Jung called this psychic infection, the unconscious transmission of psychological content from one person to another, a contagion that operates below the level of conscious awareness, infecting individuals who lack the ego strength to maintain their own psychological boundaries. Most clinicians dismissed this as suggestion or imitation, but Jung recognized something deeper. These patients weren't choosing to absorb others' states. They lacked the psychological differentiation required to filter them out. Their ego boundaries had never properly formed. In healthy psychological development, the ego, your sense of I, gradually differentiates from the collective unconscious during childhood. You learn where you end and others begin. You develop the capacity to distinguish between your emotional content and absorbed emotional content. You build psychological walls, not walls that isolate you, but walls that allow you to open a door consciously, rather than remaining permanently dissolved into everyone around you. But for empaths, this developmental process was disrupted, usually through one of three primary mechanisms. First, narcissistic parenting, where the child's emotional reality was consistently invalidated, denied, or subordinated to the parent's needs. The child learns that their feelings don't matter, that their perceptions are wrong, that their job is to regulate the parent's emotional state rather than develop their own. The child's ego never gets to practice being a separate center of experience. Instead, they remain psychologically fused with the parent, learning to attune to subtle shifts in the parent's mood, to anticipate needs before they're expressed, to disappear themselves to maintain relational connection. This creates an adult who is brilliant at reading others but utterly lost when asked, "What do you feel? What do you need? What do you want?" Second, emotional enmeshment, where family boundaries are so porous that everyone's emotions bleed into everyone else's. There's no psychological privacy, no respect for separate inner worlds. The child absorbs the family's anxiety, depression, rage, and unspoken tensions because there's nowhere else for this content to go. In these families, expressing your own distinct feelings or needs is experienced as betrayal, as breaking the unspoken rule that we're all in this together, which really means you exist to help regulate our collective emotional state. The child learns that differentiation equals abandonment, that boundaries equal rejection, that being a separate person means being alone, so they never differentiate. They remain in perpetual merger. Third, early trauma or instability, where the environment was so unpredictable or dangerous that hypervigilant emotional attunement became necessary for survival. The child develops what therapists now call fawn response, becoming exquisitely sensitive to others' states to predict and prevent danger. This child learns to scan environments for threat, to read micro-expressions, tone shifts, energy changes, to become whatever the dangerous person needs them to be to avoid punishment or abandonment. This survival adaptation creates remarkable perceptual abilities. These children become human emotional radar systems, detecting things others miss. But this gift comes at a devastating cost. They never develop their own psychological center. Their entire sense of self becomes organized around reading and responding to external emotional states. All three pathways lead to the same outcome: an adult with a catastrophic boundary dissolution. In Jungian terms, this person suffers from incomplete ego formation combined with compensatory inflation of the feeling function. Let's break this down. The ego in Jung's model isn't the enemy of spirituality. It's the necessary container for consciousness. The ego is what allows you to say I, to have a center of experience, a locus of decision-making, a sense of continuous identity across time. Without a strong ego, you don't transcend the personal. You simply dissolve into the impersonal. Empaths typically have weak, porous egos. They lack the psychological structure that would allow them to maintain boundaries, to resist emotional contagion, to remain centered in their own experience while opening to others. But here's the compensatory mechanism Jung identified. When the ego is weak, the psyche often inflates the feeling function to compensate. The individual develops hypersensitive emotional perception as a substitute for genuine psychological differentiation. They become brilliant at feeling others' emotions, at intuiting unspoken dynamics, at sensing the mood of a room the moment they enter. This creates the illusion of advanced development, of special gifts, of evolved consciousness. But Jung would say this isn't advancement, it's compensation for developmental deficit. The empath hasn't transcended ego boundaries through spiritual practice. They never developed proper boundaries in the first place. It's like calling someone who never learned to walk a gifted flyer when they're actually just crawling. The lack of one capacity gets reframed as the presence of another. This is why empaths experience such profound suffering despite their supposed gifts. because psychic openness without ego strength isn't enlightenment. It's psychological vulnerability. You absorb others' shadow material, their repressed rage, unprocessed grief, denied darkness, without the container to transform it. So it just accumulates in your psyche, creating symptoms you can't understand because they originated in someone else. You feel others' pain without the boundaries to prevent complete merger, so their pain becomes your pain. Their depression becomes your depression. Their anxiety becomes your anxiety. You can't distinguish between resonance and absorption, between empathy and dissolution, between opening to another and disappearing into them. Jung saw this clearly in his therapeutic work. He wrote about patients who would experience his own emotional states, his own thoughts, even his own physical sensations during sessions. At first, he thought this was transference, the patient projecting onto him, but he gradually realized it was something more complex. These patients had such weak ego boundaries that they couldn't maintain psychological separation, even in the highly structured therapeutic frame. They would sit across from him and gradually become him, absorb his energy, his mood, his concerns, leave the session, carrying his psychological content as if it were their own. This taught Jung a critical lesson about the dangers of participation mystique. When two people meet and one has extremely porous boundaries, the psychological content flows primarily in one direction, from the stronger psychic field to the weaker one. The person with weak boundaries doesn't gain strength from this exchange. They become a repository for the other person's material. This is why empaths consistently end up in relationships with narcissists, addicts, and emotionally dysregulated individuals, not because they're attracted to dysfunction, but because their porous boundaries make them unconsciously attractive to people who need someone to absorb their shadow. The empath becomes the container for everyone else's unprocessed psychological material, and because they can't distinguish between their content and absorbed content, they experience this as my depression, my anxiety, my shame, my pain. They develop symptoms, illnesses, and struggles that aren't actually theirs, but which they now carry. Jung documented cases where patients developed physical symptoms matching their partner's illnesses, where they experienced pain in the exact locations where their parent had been injured, where they began speaking in the speech patterns and vocabulary of people they were close to. This isn't metaphorical or energetic. It's a documented psychological phenomenon where the boundaries between self and other become so dissolved that one person's experience literally transfers into another's body and psyche. Modern neuroscience has actually validated Jung's observations. Studies on mirror neurons show that humans are neurologically wired for empathy. We have brain cells that fire both when we experience something and when we observe others experiencing it. But in empaths, these systems are hyperactivated. Their mirror neurons fire more intensely and more frequently than normal. They literally experience neural resonance with others' states more powerfully than most people. At the same time, brain imaging studies show that empaths have underactivation in self-referential regions, the parts of the brain that maintain your sense of separate self, that process your own emotional states, that create the feeling of I am distinct from you. So the neuroscience confirms what Jung observed clinically. Empaths have overactive systems for absorbing others combined with underactive systems for maintaining self. This creates the perfect storm for boundary dissolution. Research on childhood development adds another layer. Children raised by emotionally unstable or narcissistic parents develop what psychologists call hypervigilant empathy, an anxious, scanning form of emotional attunement where the child constantly monitors the parent's state to predict and prevent danger. This isn't the relaxed, secure empathy of someone who feels safe enough to attune to others while maintaining their own center. It's the desperate survival-based empathy of someone who learned that accurate emotional reading meant the difference between safety and abandonment. These children develop extraordinary perceptual abilities, but they do so at the cost of their own psychological development. They become expert at reading others while remaining utterly disconnected from their own inner experience. This is the core of the empath's suffering. You've developed the capacity to feel everyone's everything, but you've lost the capacity to feel your own anything. You can walk into a room and immediately sense tension, unspoken conflict, hidden sadness, but you can't answer the simple question, "What do you want for dinner?" You can intuit exactly what your partner needs to feel better, but you have no idea what you need, what you feel, what you desire. Your extraordinary perceptual abilities are compensation for extraordinary loss of self. Jung called this living outside your own life. You become so skilled at inhabiting others' psychological realities that you've never actually inhabited your own. This is participation mystique in its modern form, not the tribal belief that you and the corn crop are mystically united, but the lived experience of being so psychologically fused with others that you've disappeared as a separate entity. And the tragedy is that our culture celebrates this. We call it being compassionate. We praise it as emotional intelligence. We frame it as being a good person who really cares about others. But Jung would say, this isn't compassion. It's compulsion. It's not love. It's loss of self. It's not caring about others. It's being unable to maintain the psychological boundaries required for genuine relating. Real compassion emerges from fullness, not from void. Real love requires two people, not one person dissolved into another. Real connection happens between differentiated individuals, not in the merger of undifferentiated consciousness. Until empaths understand this, until they recognize their boundary dissolution as developmental trauma rather than spiritual gift, they will continue to suffer. They will continue to disappear into relationships, convinced their self-sacrifice proves their love. They will continue to experience chronic exhaustion, believing they're just too sensitive for this world. They will continue to lose themselves, mistaking dissolution for connection, and they will never discover what Jung knew, that the journey to genuine compassion begins not with opening wider to others, but with building the psychological walls that allow conscious opening rather than unconscious merger. The empath's true work isn't learning better energy protection techniques. It's developing, for the first time in their life, an actual ego, a center that can hold, a self that doesn't dissolve. Let's look at exactly what this looks like in a real person's life. Maya was 32 when she stopped recognizing herself in the mirror. Not metaphorically. Literally, she would stand in front of the bathroom mirror in the morning and see a stranger's face looking back. The features were familiar, her nose, her eyes, her hair, but the person behind them was gone. She'd been in a relationship with Marcus for 3 years, a charismatic artist who struggled with depression, childhood trauma, and an addiction to validation that kept him perpetually seeking attention from other women while remaining emotionally dependent on Maya. In the beginning, Maya experienced their connection as destiny. She could feel what he felt. She knew what he needed before he asked. She absorbed his pain and made it lighter. She called herself an empath. She believed her sensitivity was a gift that allowed her to love him more deeply than anyone ever had. What she didn't realize was that she was disappearing. The process was so gradual that she didn't notice. Small accommodations that felt like love. Tiny adjustments that seemed like compromise. Minor sacrifices that appeared as devotion. But Jung would have recognized exactly what was happening. Maya was enacting complete participation mystique, dissolving her boundaries so thoroughly that Marcus's psychological reality became hers. Let me show you how it unfolded. Month 1. The feeling of merger. Maya describes their early connection as mystical. She would think about Marcus and he would text. She would feel a wave of sadness and later discover he'd been crying. She could sense his presence before he arrived. She interpreted this as spiritual connection, as twin flame recognition, as proof they were meant to be together. But from a Jungian perspective, something else was happening. Maya's porous boundaries were already allowing Marcus's psychological content to flow directly into her consciousness. She wasn't experiencing mystical attunement. She was experiencing psychic infection. Her weak ego boundaries meant she had no filter between his emotional states and her own awareness. So his sadness became her sadness. His anxiety became her anxiety. His desire to text her created an impulse in her consciousness that she experienced as her own thought. This wasn't telepathy, it was boundary dissolution. Month 3, the absorption begins. Maya started noticing that her own moods shifted dramatically based on Marcus's state. If he woke up happy, she felt euphoric. If he woke up depressed, she felt hopeless. If he was angry about something at work, she felt rage. Not about her own life, but about his situation, as if it were happening to her. She couldn't understand why she felt so emotionally unstable when her own life circumstances were actually fine. She started journaling, trying to track her moods, looking for patterns. It never occurred to her to track his moods, because she couldn't distinguish between her emotional content and his. She experienced his states as if they were genuinely hers, not absorbed from him, but arising from her own psyche. Jung documented this exact phenomenon in his early clinical work. He noticed that patients in participation Mystique don't experience absorption as coming from outside. They experience it as their own authentic feeling. This is what makes it so dangerous. If you knew you were absorbing someone else's depression, you could potentially maintain some distance. But when you experience the absorbed depression as your own genuine depression, you have no defense against it. You're not defending against an external intrusion. You're experiencing an internal state. Maya began seeing a therapist for what she called my mood instability. She tried medication. She changed her diet. She started meditation practice. None of it worked, because the problem wasn't her inherent mood instability. It was her complete lack of psychological boundaries. Month 6. Identity shapeshifting. Maya's friends started commenting that she seemed different. She'd always been creative, drawn to writing and painting, but she stopped engaging with her own artistic practice and instead spent all her time in Marcus's studio, helping him with his work. She'd always been introverted, needing significant alone time, but she found herself going to parties and social events every weekend because Marcus needed the social stimulation. She'd always dressed in bohemian, colorful styles, but her wardrobe gradually shifted to match Marcus's aesthetic, more minimalist, more neutral, more sophisticated. When friends pointed this out, Maya defended it as growing and being influenced by someone you love. But Jung would recognize it as something more troubling: persona possession. The persona in Jung's model is the social mask we wear. It's how we present ourselves to the world. A healthy persona is flexible. We can shift it based on context while maintaining an authentic core beneath the mask. But Maya didn't have an authentic core. Her underdeveloped ego meant she had no stable center of identity beneath the persona. So when she absorbed Marcus's preferences, his aesthetic, his social needs, they didn't overlay her own preferences. They replaced them, because there was nothing solid there to replace. She became whatever he needed her to be, not through conscious choice, but through automatic absorption. His reality was stronger than hers, so it simply overwrote her weak sense of self. Month 12. The abandonment of boundaries. By the 1-year mark, Maya had stopped maintaining any boundaries at all. She quit her job to work part-time so she could be more available to Marcus. She stopped seeing friends unless Marcus came with her. She moved into his apartment and got rid of most of her possessions because we don't need two of everything. When Marcus needed emotional support at 3 a.m., she woke up and provided it, even when she had important work the next day. When Marcus flirted with other women at parties, she smiled and acted unbothered because expressing her pain or jealousy might make him feel guilty, and she couldn't bear being the source of his discomfort. When Marcus criticized her, the way she dressed, her body, her lack of ambition, she took it as helpful feedback and tried to change, rather than recognizing it as his own shadow material being projected onto her. She had become what Jung called a psychic container for Marcus's unprocessed material. All his insecurity, his rage at his father, his fear of abandonment, his shame about his creative blocks, all of it flowed into Maya, and she absorbed it, taking responsibility for soothing, managing, and transforming his difficult emotions. She called this loving him through his darkness. Jung would call it catastrophic boundary collapse combined with inflation of the savior archetype. Maya wasn't consciously trying to save Marcus, but she'd become possessed by the rescuer role, believing she alone could heal his wounds, believing her love could transform his pain. This inflation masked the truth. She had no idea who she was outside of this caretaking function. Month 18. Physical symptoms appear. Maya started developing mysterious physical symptoms, chronic pain in her lower back, the exact location where Marcus had injured himself in a car accident years before she met him. Insomnia matching his sleep patterns, staying awake until 2 a.m., even though she used to fall asleep by 10 p.m., digestive issues that matched the symptoms of his undiagnosed IBS. Her doctors found no physical cause. They suggested therapy for psychosomatic symptoms, but Jung would have recognized exactly what was happening. Maya was experiencing what he called psychic infection manifesting somatically. When psychological boundaries dissolve completely, the absorption doesn't stay at the emotional level. It moves into the body. Maya was literally embodying Marcus's pain. His unprocessed trauma was living in her tissues. His physical symptoms were replicating in her body. This isn't mystical. It's a documented phenomenon in cases of extreme enmeshment. The unconscious doesn't distinguish between metaphor and reality. When you psychologically become another person, your body follows. Month 24. The memory replacement. This is when Maya started losing access to her own memories. At first, she thought she was just forgetful. She couldn't remember details from her childhood, couldn't recall the names of friends from high school, couldn't access memories of her life before Marcus, but she could remember everything about his childhood, every story he'd told her, every detail of his family drama, every moment of his past. When her mother asked about Maya's own childhood memories at a family gathering, Maya went blank. But she could tell detailed stories about Marcus's childhood as if she'd lived them herself. This is the most extreme manifestation of participation Mystique Jung documented: memory replacement. When ego boundaries dissolve completely, your autobiography starts to fade. Your narrative, the story of who you are and how you became that person, gets overwritten by the other person's narrative. You stop having a history. You become a vessel for their history. Maya's therapist, finally recognizing the severity of the situation, asked her a simple question: who are you? Maya opened her mouth to answer and realized she had no idea. Every description that came to mind was relational. I'm Marcus's partner. I'm someone who loves deeply. I'm an empath who feels everything. But when pressed to describe herself outside of relationships, outside of what she did for others, outside of her sensitivity to external emotional states, there was nothing. Just void, just absence, just the terrifying recognition that she had no separate existence. Month 27, the dissociative crisis. The crisis came at a party. Someone asked Maya about her art. She'd apparently mentioned being a painter at a previous gathering. Maya looked at them confused. She didn't paint. Marcus painted. The person insisted. They'd seen her work. They remembered her talking about her creative process. Maya felt reality fracturing. She had no memory of this conversation, no memory of her own artwork. When she tried to access those memories, she could only see Marcus in his studio. She excused herself to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. The stranger's face looked back. And in that moment, Maya realized with absolute horror, she had disappeared. Not gradually, not metaphorically. She had actually ceased to exist as a separate person. She was a ghost inhabiting a body, a consciousness organized entirely around Marcus's reality, an ego so weak and porous that it had simply dissolved into his stronger psychological field. She drove home, left Marcus asleep, and checked herself into a psychiatric crisis center. The diagnosis that changed everything. The crisis counselor at the center asked Maya to describe what brought her in. Maya tried to explain but found herself speaking in Marcus's speech patterns, using his vocabulary, expressing his perspective on their relationship. The counselor stopped her gently. I asked what brought you in, not what brought him in, not what brought the relationship in, what brought Maya in. Maya stared at her for a full minute, tears streaming down her face, unable to answer. Because Maya didn't exist anymore. The counselor recognized what many mental health professionals miss. This wasn't depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder or borderline personality. This was complete ego dissolution through chronic enmeshment. Maya wasn't having a mental health crisis in the traditional sense. She was having an identity crisis, the crisis of realizing you have no identity at all. The counselor referred Maya to a Jungian analyst who specialized in boundary trauma and codependency, and that's where Maya's real journey began. Understanding the pattern through intensive therapy, Maya uncovered the origins of her boundary dissolution. Her mother had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder when Maya was 7. Her father left shortly after, unable to handle her mother's instability. Maya became her mother's emotional support system. At 7 years old, she learned to read her mother's moods, to predict rages or suicidal threats. She learned to regulate her mother's emotions because her mother couldn't. She learned to disappear her own needs because expressing them triggered her mother's abandonment terror. She learned, in other words, that survival required participation mystique. Maintaining boundaries with her mother meant risking abandonment. Being a separate person meant being alone. Having her own feelings meant losing the only parent she had left. So she never individuated. She remained in a state of psychological fusion with her mother throughout childhood and adolescence. And as an adult, she unconsciously recreated the exact same dynamic with Marcus. She chose a partner who was emotionally unstable and needed constant regulation. She absorbed his moods and took responsibility for his emotional state. She disappeared herself to maintain the relationship, because this was the only form of connection she knew, the only version of love she'd ever experienced. Maya's empath gifts weren't spiritual abilities. They were survival adaptations from childhood trauma that had never been processed or healed. Her extraordinary sensitivity to Marcus's states wasn't mystical attunement. It was the hypervigilance of a traumatized child, still scanning for danger in an adult body. Her inability to maintain boundaries wasn't evidence of how much she loved him. It was evidence of how thoroughly her own ego development had been arrested. The long road back Maya's recovery took 3 years of intensive therapy. It required her to do something that felt impossible. Leave Marcus and spend time alone. Genuinely alone. Not in another relationship. Not dating. Not even deep friendships for a while. Because she needed space to discover who she was without anyone else's psychological content filling her consciousness. She needed to learn for the first time in her life what it felt like to exist as a separate person. The first 6 months were excruciating. Maya experienced panic attacks, overwhelming guilt, and the constant urge to return to Marcus to make sure he was okay. But her analyst helped her see those feelings were the withdrawal symptoms of participation mystique. Her psyche had been addicted to merger, and separation felt like death, because in a very real sense, it was death. The death of the only identity she'd ever known. The selfless empath who existed to absorb and soothe others' pain. The death of the persona that had protected her from ever having to face her own inner void. The death of the compensatory structure that had hidden the truth. She had never developed an actual self. And on the other side of that death, something new could emerge. Through the practical exercises her analyst prescribed, daily boundary rituals, shadow integration work, anima development practices, Maya slowly began to feel the edges of her own being. She started noticing her own preferences, her own emotions, her own desires that weren't reactions to someone else's needs. She began saying no, setting limits, disappointing people, tolerating their discomfort without absorbing it. She confronted her shadow, the rage at her mother for using her as an emotional support system, the resentment toward Marcus for accepting her self-sacrifice, the part of her that Heidi secretly enjoyed being needed because it gave her identity and purpose. She integrated her disowned aggression, learning that boundaries weren't violence, that saying no wasn't cruelty, that prioritizing herself wasn't narcissism. She developed what Jung called her animus, her inner masculine capacity for assertion, direction, and autonomous action rather than endlessly adapting to others' needs. And eventually, 3 years later, Maya reported something astonishing. I can feel other people's emotions now without becoming them. I can be present to someone's pain without absorbing it. I can love someone without disappearing. She had achieved what Jung called psychological differentiation, not by shutting down her sensitivity, not by becoming cold or disconnected, but by developing finally a strong enough ego to maintain boundaries while remaining open. Maya's story demonstrates all 10 mechanisms of empath self-loss that we're about to explore, and it shows both the catastrophic danger of unaddressed boundary dissolution and the radical possibility of individuation. But first, we need to understand what modern research reveals about this phenomenon. Because Jung's clinical observations weren't just psychological theory, they're now validated by neuroscience, attachment research, and developmental psychology. Jung's observations about participation mystique and boundary dissolution weren't mystical speculation. They were precise clinical documentation of measurable psychological and neurological phenomena, and modern research has validated virtually everything he observed. Let's start with the neuroscience, the mirror neuron discovery. In the 1990s, Italian researchers made a groundbreaking discovery: mirror neurons. These are brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that action. You watch someone reach for a cup, and the same neurons fire in your brain as if you were reaching for the cup yourself. This neural system is the biological basis for empathy. It's how we understand others' intentions, emotions, and experiences by internally simulating them in our own neural networks. Everyone has mirror neurons, but here's what makes empaths different. Brain imaging studies show that individuals who identify as highly empathic or empaths have significantly stronger activation in mirror neuron regions when observing others' emotional states. When they watch someone experiencing pain, their anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions involved in processing emotional pain, show activation levels nearly identical to if they were experiencing the pain themselves. This isn't just understanding someone's pain. It's neurologically experiencing their pain as your own. But the neuroscience reveals something even more significant. While empaths show hyperactivation in systems for simulating others' experiences, they show underactivation in regions associated with self-other distinction, specifically the temporoparietal junction and medial prefrontal cortex, areas that normally help you distinguish between your own mental states and others' mental states, show reduced activity in empaths. This creates a neural pattern Jung would recognize immediately: excessive capacity for absorbing others' content, combined with insufficient capacity for maintaining psychological separation. You're wired to feel everything others feel, but you're not wired to remember that what you're feeling isn't actually yours. The Attachment Origins developmental psychology has traced this neural pattern back to childhood attachment experiences. Researchers studying attachment styles have identified what they call anxious preoccupied attachment, a pattern that emerges when primary caregivers are inconsistent, emotionally unstable, or narcissistic. Children with these caregivers develop hypervigilant monitoring of the caregiver's emotional state. They become expert at reading subtle cues, facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, because accurate reading means better prediction of the caregiver's behavior. Will mom be loving today or rageful? Will dad be present or dissociated? Will expressing my needs trigger abandonment or acceptance? This hypervigilant empathy becomes literally wired into the developing brain. Studies using fMRI to scan the brains of adults with anxious attachment show exactly what Jung observed: chronic activation of threat detection systems, hyperactive mirror neuron networks, and reduced activity in regions that maintain self-other boundaries. These individuals didn't choose to become empathic. Their brains were sculpted by survival necessity to prioritize reading and regulating others' emotions over developing their own emotional autonomy. And here's the critical finding: this pattern persists into adulthood, even when the original threat is gone. The adult child of narcissistic parents continues scanning environments for emotional threat, continues automatically absorbing others' states, continues prioritizing others' needs over their own, not because they want to, but because their neural networks were organized around this pattern during critical developmental windows. This is why telling empaths to just set boundaries or stop caring so much is useless. You're asking them to override neural patterns established in childhood, to resist automatic processes that operate below conscious awareness. It's like telling someone with a phobia to just stop being afraid. The fear isn't chosen, it's hardwired. The projective identification mechanism. Perhaps the most important validation of Jung's work comes from research on projective identification. This is a concept from psychoanalysis that describes a sophisticated psychological process. One person projects unwanted aspects of themselves onto another person, but instead of just perceiving those qualities in the other person, they unconsciously evoke those qualities in them, making them actually experience and express what was projected. Example: a man who can't tolerate his own vulnerability projects it onto his partner, treating her as fragile and overly emotional. Through this treatment, she gradually becomes more emotional and fragile, actually embodying his disowned vulnerability. Research shows that individuals with weak ego boundaries are particularly susceptible to absorbing these projections. They don't just get perceived as having certain qualities, They actually take on those qualities, experiencing them as their own authentic feelings and traits. This is exactly what Jung observed in participation mystique. The person with stronger boundaries unconsciously deposits their shadow material into the person with weaker boundaries, who then lives it out. Studies of couples where one partner has borderline or narcissistic traits and the other has empath traits show this pattern consistently. The narcissistic partner disowns their vulnerability, neediness, and emotional pain. The empathic partner gradually develops increasingly intense versions of these states, becoming more anxious, more needy, more emotionally dysregulated, while the narcissistic partner becomes more distant and strong. The empathic partner experiences this as my anxiety or my neediness. They seek treatment for their symptoms, but a Jungian analysis reveals they're carrying the relationship's disowned vulnerability. They're the container for both people's shadow material. This is why empaths often develop symptoms, depression, anxiety, physical illness, that mysteriously improve when they leave certain relationships. It wasn't their pathology, it was absorbed pathology they were holding for someone else. The emotional labor research, sociological research on emotional labor, adds another layer of validation. Emotional labor is the work of managing your own and others' emotions to create desired emotional states. It includes things like soothing upset customers, managing difficult family dynamics, or maintaining harmony in social situations. Studies consistently show that empaths, particularly women socialized into caretaking roles, perform vastly disproportionate amounts of emotional labor in relationships and workplaces. But here's what the research reveals about the cost. Chronic emotional labor, especially when unreciprocated, leads to what's called compassion fatigue or empathy burnout. Symptoms include emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, reduced sense of accomplishment, physical illness, and eventually, complete emotional numbing. In other words, empaths who constantly give emotional support without receiving it eventually lose the capacity to feel at all. Jung would recognize this as the psyche's last-ditch protective mechanism. When boundary dissolution threatens complete annihilation of the self, consciousness shuts down feeling entirely. You become numb not because you're depressed, but because your psyche is trying to save you from drowning in absorbed emotional content. Studies of therapists, nurses, and other helping professionals who often identify as empathic show alarmingly high rates of this pattern. The very sensitivity that drew them to helping professions becomes the mechanism of their destruction when it isn't balanced with strong boundaries. The enmeshment studies family systems research has extensively documented the phenomenon Jung called participation mystique under the term enmeshment. Enmeshed families are characterized by poorly defined boundaries between members, limited individual autonomy, collective emotional regulation. Everyone's mood affects everyone else. Difficulty with separation and individuation. Fusion of identity. Family members don't develop distinct sense of self. Longitudinal studies following children from enmeshed families into adulthood show consistent patterns. These individuals struggle with intimate relationships, alternating between anxious clinging and panicked withdrawal. They have difficulty making decisions without consulting others. They experience others' emotions as their own. They lack clear sense of personal identity separate from relational roles. In other words, they show exactly the symptoms Jung attributed to incomplete individuation and arrested ego development. Most significantly, these studies show that enmeshment isn't overcome through insight alone. It requires active intervention, therapy, boundary practice, often physical separation from the enmeshed system, to allow belated ego development. Knowing you're enmeshed doesn't free you from enmeshment. You have to actively build the psychological structures that should have developed in childhood but didn't. The epigenetics of trauma. Recent epigenetic research reveals something even more profound. Trauma and chronic stress can alter gene expression in ways that get passed to offspring. Studies of Holocaust survivors and their children show that trauma literally changes which genes are active and which are dormant. These changes affect stress response systems, emotional regulation, and, relevant to our discussion, boundary formation. Children of traumatized parents often show the same hypervigilant, boundary-less patterns their parents developed in response to actual threat, even though the children never experienced that threat directly. The empathic child of an empath may be born with a genetic predisposition toward weak boundaries and hyperactive emotional contagion systems. This doesn't mean the pattern is unchangeable. Epigenetic changes can be reversed through environmental changes and therapeutic intervention. But it does mean that for some empaths, the boundary dissolution isn't just learned behavior. It's literally in their biology, passed down through generations of trauma and adaptation. Jung would call this psychic inheritance, the collective unconscious expressing through inherited vulnerabilities and patterns. The chronic illness connection medical research has documented strong correlations between boundary-less empathy and chronic illness. Studies show that individuals who consistently suppress their own needs, who absorb others' stress, and who lack healthy boundaries have significantly higher rates of autoimmune disorders, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain conditions, depression, and anxiety disorders. The mechanism appears to be chronic activation of stress response systems, combined with disrupted stress recovery. When you're constantly absorbing others' emotions, your nervous system never fully returns to baseline. You're in a state of perpetual low-level activation, which over time exhausts your body's regulatory systems. Your immune system starts attacking your own tissues. Your adrenal glands burn out. Your digestive system becomes dysregulated. Your pain perception amplifies. Jung observed this in his patients. Those with the weakest boundaries often developed the most severe physical symptoms. He understood that when psychological boundaries fail, the body attempts to create boundaries through illness, forcing the person to rest, to withdraw, to finally prioritize their own needs. Chronic illness in empaths is often the body's desperate attempt to individuate when the psyche won't. The therapeutic implications. All of this research points to the same conclusion Jung reached. Empathic boundary dissolution isn't a gift to cultivate. It's a trauma pattern to heal. The therapeutic approach needs to focus not on managing empathic overwhelm, but on building the ego structures that should have developed in childhood. This means strengthening sense of separate self, developing capacity to distinguish own emotions from absorbed emotions, building tolerance for others' discomfort without absorbing or fixing it, integrating disowned aggression and healthy selfishness, practicing active boundary setting until it becomes automatic. Standard approaches that treat empaths as highly sensitive people who need better coping strategies miss the fundamental issue. You don't need better coping strategies for weak boundaries. You need to develop actual boundaries. You don't need techniques to manage emotional overwhelm. You need to stop absorbing others' emotions in the first place. You don't need more self-care after giving endlessly. You need to stop giving from depletion. Jung's approach, focused on individuation, ego strengthening, and shadow integration, addresses the root cause rather than managing symptoms, and the research validates his approach. Studies of therapy outcomes show that interventions focused on boundary development, assertiveness training, and differentiation produce better long-term results for empaths than supportive therapy or medication alone. Because the problem isn't that empaths feel too much. It's that they never developed the psychological container to hold what they feel without it consuming them. The solution isn't dampening their sensitivity. It's building the ego strength that allows them to be sensitive without being porous, open without being dissolved, compassionate without being consumed. This is the empath's true work, not protecting their sensitivity, but developing the structure that makes their sensitivity sustainable. Not hiding from the world, but building the inner walls that allow them to open to the world consciously, rather than drowning in it unconsciously. Now let's examine the exact mechanisms through which this drowning occurs. The 10 specific ways empaths lose themselves and disappear into the people they love. Jung identified specific patterns through which consciousness dissolves back into the collective unconscious. Specific mechanisms through which the individuated self collapses into participation mystique. For empaths, these mechanisms aren't abstract psychological concepts. They're the lived reality of daily self-abandonment. Let me show you exactly how you disappear. This is the foundation of all empath suffering, the unconscious absorption of others' emotional states without awareness or filtering. You walk into a room feeling peaceful. Within minutes, you're anxious. You have no idea why. Later, you discover your coworker was having a panic attack in the next room. You absorbed their anxiety through the walls. You wake up feeling hopeful. By noon, you're depressed. You search your life for what triggered the shift. There's nothing. Then your partner comes home and mentions they've been struggling with dark thoughts all morning. You were feeling their depression before they even told you about it. This isn't empathy. Empathy is understanding what someone feels. This is becoming what someone feels. Jung observed this in his clinical work. Patients who would enter his office in one emotional state and leave in a completely different one. Not because anything happened in the session, but because they'd absorbed Jung's own state. If Jung was tired, they became tired. If Jung was irritated about something in his personal life, they became irritated. If Jung was calm and grounded, they became calm and grounded. Their emotional state was determined entirely by the strongest emotional field in their environment. The mechanism, your mirror neuron systems fire intensely when you perceive others' emotions. Your brain simulates their emotional state to understand it. But your temporoparietal junction, the region that normally tags this simulation as not mine, fails to activate strongly enough. So the simulated emotion becomes your actual emotion. You don't experience it as absorption. You experience it as your own authentic feeling arising from your own psyche. This is what makes it dangerous. You have no awareness that what you're feeling isn't yours, so you can't defend against it. You can't process it. You can't return it. You just carry it indefinitely. Childhood origins. Most empaths learned emotional osmosis in homes where a caregiver's mood determined the entire family's emotional atmosphere. If mom was depressed, everyone was depressed. If dad was angry, everyone walked on eggshells. The child learned to monitor and absorb the dominant emotional field as a survival strategy. Feeling what the powerful person felt meant being able to predict their behavior and avoid danger. Shadow material avoided. Your own emotional reality. If you're constantly filled with absorbed emotions, you never have to face your own grief, rage, fear, or joy. The absorbed content provides a substitute for genuine feeling, recognition signs, mood shifts that don't correlate with your own life circumstances. Feeling drained after social interaction, even pleasant interaction, difficulty identifying what you actually feel versus what you've absorbed. Physical symptoms, headaches, nausea, fatigue, after being around certain people, needing extensive alone time to clear yourself before you can access your own emotions. This is where you unconsciously mold your personality, interests, values, and preferences to match whoever you're with. With your intellectual friend, you become more analytical. With your spiritual friend, you become more mystical. With your athletic friend, you become more fitness-focused. It feels like being adaptable, like being open-minded, like having diverse interests. But Jung would recognize it as something more troubling. You have no stable core identity beneath the shifting personas. The persona, remember, is supposed to be a mask you can put on and take off. But for empaths, the persona isn't covering anything. It's not a mask over a face. It's a mask over emptiness. You become whoever the situation requires because there's no solid self beneath to conflict with the adaptation. In relationships, this becomes extreme. You gradually adopt your partner's taste in music, food, politics, spirituality, lifestyle, and worldview. You stop pursuing your own interests and become absorbed in theirs. You abandon your friends for their friend group. You change your appearance to match their preferences, and you genuinely don't notice it's happening because each individual adaptation seems minor, reasonable, like healthy compromise. But the cumulative effect is complete identity replacement. Childhood origins. This pattern typically develops in families where the child's authentic self was unacceptable, where love and acceptance were conditional on being what the parents needed you to be. The child learns that having preferences, opinions, or an autonomous identity triggers rejection. So they learn to shapeshift, to read what's wanted and become that. The problem, they never develop an actual identity beneath the shapeshifting. They become a blank screen onto which others project what they need. Shadow material avoided. Your authentic self with all its unacceptable qualities. Your real preferences that might disappoint others. Your genuine personality that might not be lovable. If you're constantly shapeshifting, you never have to risk being rejected for who you actually are. Because who you actually are never emerges. Recognition signs, friends from different life areas, noting you seem like a different person in each context. Difficulty answering questions about your preferences, especially when no one else's opinion is present. Your personality, interests, and style dramatically shift when you enter new relationships. Looking back at past relationships and barely recognizing who you were. Feeling like you're performing or acting even in intimate relationships. This is compulsively managing, soothing, and regulating others' emotions while completely abandoning your own. Someone near you feels sad. Before they even express it, you're moving toward them, asking what's wrong, offering comfort, trying to fix their pain. Someone expresses anxiety. You immediately start problem-solving, providing reassurance, taking on their worry as your own responsibility. Someone shows anger. You become the mediator, the soother, the one who absorbs the aggression to prevent conflict. You've become what Jung would call a container for the collective shadow, the person who holds, processes, and transforms everyone else's difficult emotions. The mechanism works through projection, but in reverse. Normally, projection means putting your own qualities onto others. You're angry, so you perceive others as angry. But empaths engage in what Jung called projective identification reversal. You take on the qualities others need someone to hold. They need someone to carry their vulnerability. You become increasingly vulnerable. They need someone to express their sadness. You become the sad one while they remain strong. They need someone to absorb their rage. You take it in and experience it as your own anger, often directed at yourself. This appears as caring, as compassion, as love. But Jung would recognize it as psychological compensation. You're doing for others what you desperately need someone to do for you. The empath who constantly soothes others is usually the one who most needs soothing. The one who holds everyone else's grief is drowning in unprocessed grief of their own. The one who manages everyone's anxiety is secretly terrified. Childhood origins. This develops in families where the child becomes the emotional caretaker for the parents, what's called parentification. The child learns their value lies in managing others' emotional states. They become the family therapist, the mediator, the one who keeps everyone calm. They never learn that their own emotions matter, that they deserve care, that love includes receiving, not just giving. Shadow material avoided. Your own neediness, vulnerability, and desperate desire to be cared for. If you're constantly the caregiver, you never have to face how much you need someone to care for you. You never have to risk asking for support and being refused. You never have to feel the shame of admitting you're not endlessly capable. Recognition signs. Others consistently come to you with their problems, but rarely ask about yours. Difficulty receiving help or emotional support, even when struggling. Feeling responsible for others' emotional states and mood shifts. Automatic movement towards soothing any expressed distress, even from strangers. Physical exhaustion and resentment that you can't acknowledge or express. This is the complete inability to say no, set limits, or maintain psychological separation from others' needs and demands. Someone asks for your time. You say yes even when you're exhausted, even when it violates your own plans, even when you resent it. Someone expresses a need. You experience it as more urgent and more real than your own needs. Their discomfort feels unbearable. Your discomfort feels irrelevant. Someone pushes against your limits. You immediately collapse the boundary rather than tolerate the conflict that defending it would create. Jung would see this as catastrophic ego weakness. There's no center of consciousness strong enough to maintain boundaries against external pressure. The ego's job is to mediate between the inner world and outer world, between your needs and others' demands, between the self and the environment. But the empath's ego is too weak to perform this function, so external demands just flow in, completely overriding internal needs. It's like having a house with no doors or walls. Anyone can enter, anything can come in. You have no control over what crosses the threshold because there is no threshold. Childhood origins. Boundaries are learned. They're taught through having your no respected, your privacy honored, your physical and emotional space protected. Empaths typically grew up in environments where boundaries were violated constantly. Parents barging into rooms without knocking, reading private journals, demanding access to the child's emotional inner world, punishing assertion or refusal. The child learns that boundaries equal punishment, that saying no triggers rage or abandonment, that the only safe response is complete openness and compliance. Shadow material. Avoided. Your healthy aggression and self-protection instincts, your desire to defend yourself, your right to exist as a separate being with your own territory. If you never say no, you never have. To feel the fear of rejection. You never have to risk conflict. You never have to face your own anger at violations. Recognition signs. Saying yes when you mean no, then resenting the commitment, feeling unable to end conversations, leave situations, or extract yourself from obligations, others' needs, feeling more real or important than your own physical sensation of having no edges or skin between you and others. Chronic overcommitment and inability to prioritize your own time. This goes beyond feeling others' emotions. You absorb their beliefs, traumas, psychological complexes, and shadow material as if they were your own. You spend time with someone who has father wound. Gradually, you start feeling rage toward father figures. But your own father was loving. The rage isn't yours. It's absorbed from them. Your partner has unprocessed sexual trauma. You begin developing anxiety around intimacy, even though you've never been traumatized. Their unprocessed experience is living in your psyche. Your friend has deep shame about their body. You start experiencing the same shame about your own body, even though you were previously comfortable. This is what Jung called psychic infection in its most extreme form. You're not just resonating with others' psychological content, you're downloading it into your own unconscious, where it operates as if it were your own material. The mechanism: in healthy psychological development, you have strong enough boundaries that others' shadow material bounces off. You can perceive it, perhaps even understand it, but you don't absorb it. But the empath's boundaries are so porous that shadow material from others flows directly in and lodges in the unconscious, where it begins generating its own symptoms, emotions, and beliefs. This is why empaths often develop symptoms, anxiety, depression, phobias, that mysteriously disappear when they leave certain relationships. It was never their pathology. It was absorbed pathology that finally got removed when the source was removed. Childhood origins. This typically develops in families with significant unprocessed trauma, addiction, or mental illness. The parents project their own unprocessed shadow material onto the empathic child, who absorbs and carries it. The child becomes the repository for the family's collective darkness. The child develops symptoms representing the family's unlived pain. Their anxiety is dad's repressed fear. Their depression is mom's unprocessed grief. Their rage is generations of family trauma. Shadow material avoided. If you're carrying everyone else's shadow material, your own shadow stays hidden. Your own rage stays buried beneath absorbed rage. Your own grief stays concealed beneath absorbed grief. Recognition signs: developing emotional or physical symptoms that match those of people you're close to. Beliefs or fears emerging that don't match your own history or experience. Feeling like you're carrying weight or darkness that isn't yours but can't identify where it came from. Symptoms that dramatically improve when you distance yourself from certain people. Complex trauma symptoms without corresponding traumatic experiences in your own history. This is mistaking self-sacrifice for love, martyrdom for devotion, and self-erasure for proof of authentic caring. You believe that the more you give up yourself, the more you prove your love, that disappearing your needs demonstrates your devotion, that the most loving thing you can do is need nothing. Jung would recognize this as projection of the anima for men or animus for women, the contrasexual archetype that should be developing internally but instead gets sought externally through complete merger. For women, you project your animus, inner masculine, your capacity for boundaries, direction, assertion, autonomy, onto your partner. Then you merge with him to access these qualities rather than developing them in yourself. You become supportive of his goals while abandoning yours. You draw strength from his confidence while never building your own. You feel whole only when connected to him because he's carrying your unlived masculine qualities. For men, you project your anima, inner feminine, your capacity for feeling, receptivity, vulnerability, emotional depth, onto your partner. Then you merge with her to access these qualities rather than integrating them internally. You feel only through her feelings. You access vulnerability only through her vulnerability. You experience emotional depth only by absorbing hers. In both cases, the result is the same. You require merger to feel whole because you're psychologically incomplete. Childhood origins. This develops in families where one parent was weak or absent, forcing the child to compensate. Girls with absent fathers often never develop their internal masculine, remaining dependent on external masculine figures for direction and strength. Boys with absent or emotionally disconnected mothers never develop their internal feminine, remaining dependent on external feminine figures for emotional access. Shadow material. Avoided your own wholeness. your capacity to be complete within yourself, your ability to access both masculine and feminine qualities internally. If you believe you need another person to be whole, you never have to face your own completeness. You never have to take responsibility for your own development. Recognition signs: feeling incomplete or not fully alive when single, losing yourself completely in relationships while feeling more whole, drawing all your strength, direction, or emotional access from your partner, identity completely organized around being the supporter or the feeling one, terror of being alone because it means losing access to parts of yourself. This is experiencing such complete merger in intimate relationships that you lose track of your own desires, needs, memories, and even sense of physical boundaries. Sex becomes an act of ego dissolution, rather than union of two whole beings. You don't experience "we're connecting," you experience "I'm disappearing." In moments of emotional or physical intimacy, your sense of separate selfhood vanishes. You can't tell where your body ends and theirs begins. You can't distinguish your pleasure from theirs. This feels mystical, spiritual, like the deepest form of connection. But Jung would say, this isn't the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of two individuated selves. This is conjunctio pathology, ego annihilation masquerading as spiritual union. Real conjunctio requires two whole individuals consciously choosing union while maintaining their separate centers. What empaths experience is unconscious dissolution where there were never two whole people to begin with. Childhood origins. This often traces to boundary violations in childhood, physical, emotional, or sexual experiences where the child's bodily and psychological boundaries were not respected. The child never develops a felt sense of having their own body, their own emotional territory, their own inviolable space. Shadow material, avoided, your terror of genuine intimacy. If you dissolve during intimate moments, you never have to risk being truly seen as a separate person and potentially rejected. Dissolution feels safer than differentiated intimacy because there's no you present to be judged. Recognition signs. Dissociative experiences during sex or emotional intimacy, unable to access your own desires or preferences in intimate moments, physical sensation of merging or disappearing during closeness, intimacy triggering identity confusion or memory distortion, need for significant space after intimacy to find yourself again. This is unconsciously lowering or raising your frequency to match whoever you're with. Your partner is depressed. Within days, you're depressed, not because anything in your life changed, but because you automatically matched their state. Your friend is anxious. You become anxious. Your coworker is euphoric. You become euphoric. You're like a tuning fork that vibrates at whatever frequency hits it. You have no consistent internal vibration of your own. Jung would see this as identification with the collective unconscious, rather than standing in your individuated self. The collective unconscious is the shared psychic field. The individuated self is your unique, differentiated center within that field. Empaths remain dissolved in the collective, taking on whatever frequency is dominant, never maintaining their own. Childhood origins. Family systems where there was no room for individual emotional states, where the collective mood was absolute and individual variation was forbidden. Shadow material avoided, your own emotional baseline, your authentic energetic state, your responsibility for maintaining your own inner climate, regardless of external conditions. Recognition signs. Emotional state entirely determined by who you've been around, no consistent baseline mood or energy level. Feeling like you pick up others' energy automatically, need to isolate completely to feel your own state. Others describe you as mercurial or emotionally unpredictable. This is becoming possessed by the savior-rescuer archetype. believing you alone can heal, fix, or save the other person. You meet someone struggling and immediately feel it's your responsibility to save them, not to support them, to save them. You believe your love can heal their trauma. Your presence can cure their depression. Your devotion can transform their life. This is archetypal inflation. The archetype of the savior has possessed your ego, creating grandiose beliefs about your own importance and impact. Jung understood that archetypes, when they possess the ego, create inflation, an overestimation of your own significance and power. The inflated savior believes they have special healing abilities, that they're the only one who truly understands the suffering person, that their departure would destroy the other. This inflation masks its opposite, deep feelings of inadequacy. If you're not saving someone, who are you? If you're not needed, do you have value? If you're not the rescuer, do you matter? Childhood origins. The parentified child who learned their only value was in caretaking. The child of an addict or mentally ill parent who developed a savior complex to cope with powerlessness. Shadow material. Avoided your own inadequacy, powerlessness, and need to be saved. If you're the savior, you never have to be the one who needs saving. Recognition signs. Consistently attracted to broken people who need fixing, staying in destructive relationships because they need me. Believing you're the only one who can help certain people. Identity collapse when not actively rescuing someone. Resentment toward those you're helping when they don't transform. This is the most extreme mechanism, gradually losing access to your own memories, history, and narrative, while your consciousness fills with the other person's story. Your autobiography becomes their biography. Your childhood fades while theirs becomes vivid. Your past experiences blur while theirs sharpen. Jung documented this in cases of extreme psychological possession where the self nearly disappears entirely. The mechanism. Memory consolidation requires a stable sense of self to organize experiences into a coherent narrative. When your sense of self is unstable, constantly shifting to merge with others, your memories have no central reference point, so they fade, become inaccessible, get overwritten by the stronger narrative of the person you've merged with. Childhood origins. Families where the child's experiences were consistently invalidated, denied, or rewritten. That didn't happen. You're remembering wrong. You're too sensitive. The child learns their own memory and perception can't be trusted. Their narrative has no validity. Only others' versions of reality matter. Shadow material avoided. Your own history with all its pain, trauma, and unlived potential. If you can't access your past, you don't have to grieve what was lost or face what was never given. Recognition signs. Difficulty recalling your own childhood, while easily recalling partners your life story told primarily through others' narratives and perspectives. Confusion about what actually happened in your past versus what you've been told. Partners' memories feeling more vivid and real than your own. Looking at old photos and feeling no connection to the person in them. These 10 mechanisms rarely operate in isolation. Most empaths experience multiple mechanisms simultaneously, creating a cascade effect where each form of self-loss reinforces the others. Emotional osmosis leads to identity shape-shifting, which enables emotional caretaking, which causes boundary collapse, which allows empathic introjection, and so on. The result is what Maya experienced, complete disappearance. But understanding the mechanisms is only the beginning. Now we need to confront the escalating dangers when these patterns continue unchecked. The existential risks of remaining in boundary-less merger. Jung warned that psychological patterns left unconscious don't remain static. They escalate, they deepen. They eventually threaten not just your happiness, but your very existence as a differentiated being. For empaths who continue losing themselves in others without intervention, there are 5 escalating dangers. Each represents a deeper level of psychological annihilation. Jung used the term loss of soul to describe a condition where the self becomes so eclipsed by external content that you literally forget who you are. This isn't metaphorical. Empaths who spend years absorbing others' emotions, adopting others' identities, and living others' lives gradually lose connection to their own soul, their own depths, their own unique essence, their own inner truth. The symptoms are unmistakable. Chronic numbness. You can feel others' emotions intensely, but your own feelings are flat, distant, inaccessible. Decision paralysis. You cannot make simple choices because you have no internal compass, no sense of what you want, need, or value. Identity confusion. When alone, you feel like a blank space. You don't know who you are outside of relationships and roles. The haunting sensation that you're living someone else's life, looking at your circumstances and feeling zero recognition or ownership. Lost time. Periods of your life that feel like they happened to someone else or didn't happen at all. Jung observed this in patients who had spent decades subordinating their own development to others' needs. Their conscious ego had become so weak and their connection to the self, the central organizing archetype, so tenuous that they existed in a kind of psychological twilight, neither fully present nor fully absent. They went through motions, performed roles, but there was no one home. The danger escalates when you start making choices that further reinforce the emptiness. You stay in relationships that drain you because at least when merged with another person, you feel like someone. Being alone means confronting the void. You become addicted to intensity, drama, crisis, emotional chaos, because it provides temporary sense of aliveness that your own inner world can't generate. You develop what Jung called provisional life, a way of living where everything feels temporary, nothing feels real. You're constantly waiting for your real life to begin, but it never does because there's no you to live it. The soul loss creates psychological fragmentation. Different parts of your psyche split off, each carrying different absorbed identities. You're one person with your mother, a different person with your partner, someone else entirely at work. These aren't healthy role adaptations. They're dissociated fragments that don't communicate with each other. Jung saw this fragmentation as the psyche's attempt to survive when wholeness is impossible. If you can't be one integrated person, you fragment into multiple partial personas, each manageable in isolation. But the cost is catastrophic. You have no central consciousness, no continuous sense of self across contexts, no integration of experience into a coherent identity. You become what Jung called plural, not in the healthy sense of containing multitudes, but in the pathological sense of having no unifying center at all. By constantly absorbing others' emotions and shadow material, empaths become repositories for collective darkness without the ego's strength to process it. Jung warned extensively about what happens when you absorb shadow content without adequate container. The shadow doesn't integrate, it possesses. You begin experiencing anxiety, depression, rage, and self-destructive impulses that don't feel like you, but which now control your behavior. The absorbed shadow starts generating symptoms, physical illness that has no medical cause. Jung documented numerous cases where absorbed psychological content manifested as actual disease, autoimmune conditions, chronic pain, digestive disorders, neurological symptoms. The psyche, unable to process the absorbed material consciously, pushes it into the body where it creates somatic symptoms, intrusive thoughts and urges that feel alien, sudden rage you can't explain, suicidal ideation that doesn't match your actual life circumstances, sexual compulsions that don't align with your values. This is shadow material from others that's lodged in your unconscious and started generating its own content. Behavioral patterns that seem to come from nowhere. You find yourself acting in ways you don't recognize, withdrawing, attacking, manipulating, not because you consciously choose these behaviors, but because you're enacting absorbed shadow material. Jung called this psychic infection and warned it could lead to complete personality transformation. The empath who absorbs a partner's narcissistic shadow can become narcissistic themselves. The empath who absorbs a parent's rage can become violent. The empath who absorbs collective depression can become suicidal. And here's what makes it truly dangerous. You experience all of this as your own pathology. You seek treatment for my depression. You try to manage my anxiety. You feel ashamed of my anger. But Jung would ask, is it actually yours? Or have you become the container for shadow material that originated elsewhere? The tragedy is that most therapists don't ask this question. They treat the symptoms as belonging to the patient, rather than recognizing them as absorbed content that needs to be identified, processed, and returned. Your boundary-less state creates a specific kind of relational dynamic that Jung would recognize as mutual possession. Empaths unconsciously attract individuals who need someone to absorb their shadow. Narcissists, addicts, borderline personalities, psychologically predatory people, all gravitating toward the empath like moths to flame. Not because empaths choose these people, but because at an unconscious level, these individuals recognize someone who can hold what they cannot hold in themselves. The resulting relationships follow a predictable pattern. Phase 1. Idealization and merger. The relationship feels destined, intense, spiritually significant. Both parties experience temporary wholeness through fusion. Phase 2. Absorption and imbalance. The empath begins absorbing all the relationship's vulnerability, neediness, emotional pain, while the other party becomes increasingly defended, distant, and strong. Phase 3. Resentment and dysfunction. The empath feels drained, invisible, used. The other party feels suffocated, responsible for the empath's emotions, burdened by guilt. Phase 4. Crisis and potential violence. One or both parties become sick, physically or psychologically. The relationship generates symptoms that force attention. Affairs, addiction, relapse, suicide attempts, serious illness. Jung understood these dynamics as archetypal. The empath carries the wounded healer archetype, while their partner carries the wounded king or queen. Both are incomplete. Both require the other to feel whole. But this isn't complementarity, it's mutual parasitism. The empath drains themselves, giving endlessly. The narcissist drains the empath by taking endlessly. Both become sick. The empath develops the physical and psychological symptoms we discussed. The narcissist, temporarily freed from their own shadow by having the empath carry it, becomes increasingly inflated, grandiose, and disconnected from reality. Then, inevitably, the relationship collapses, and both parties are worse off than when they started. The empath has lost years of their life, damaged their health, and reinforced their belief that love means self-destruction. The narcissist, suddenly deprived of their shadow container, experiences the return of all. The psychological material they'd been avoiding, and often spirals into crisis. Jung called this mutual destruction through unconscious possession. And the most dangerous aspect, these relationships are addictive. The empath experiences the merger as true love, the intensity as deep connection, the suffering as proof of devotion, so they seek it again and again. Serial enmeshment with different partners, each relationship following the identical arc, until they end up so destroyed that they either wake up and seek help, or they give up entirely on relationships and resign themselves to isolation. After years of shapeshifting and merging, empaths eventually reach a crisis point where they genuinely don't know who they are. This isn't the philosophical question, "Who am I?" that leads to spiritual awakening. This is the terrifying psychological reality of looking inward and finding nothing. No preferences, no values, no desires, no sense of continuous self across time. No authentic core beneath the accumulated layers of absorbed identities. Jung called this the confrontation with inner emptiness. The moment when you realize you've been living as a shell, a vessel for others' content, with no substance of your own. The crisis typically hits during relationship endings. When the merger partner leaves or dies, the empath faces the void. They were sustained by the other person's identity. Now there's nothing, illness or forced rest. When chronic health issues make caretaking impossible, the empath loses their compensatory identity. They can't be the helper anymore. Without that role, who are they? Middle age or life transitions. When children leave home, parents die, or retirement approaches, the empath faces decades of potentially being nobody. No one left to care for, no one left to merge with. The existential crisis manifests as profound disorientation, not knowing what you like, want, believe, or value. Every question about preferences leads to panic, loss of meaning. Everything that gave your life purpose was actually borrowed from others. Now nothing matters because there's no you to have authentic meaning. Depersonalization, looking at your reflection and seeing a stranger, hearing your voice and not recognizing it, going through your belongings and feeling no connection to any of it. This is the crisis Jung wrote about in his Red Book period, the terrifying encounter with the void at the center of being. But Jung faced this crisis after decades of ego development. He had psychological structure to hold him through it. Empaths face it with almost no ego strength, no psychological musculature, no container for the terror. Many don't survive this crisis psychologically. They completely break down, develop severe psychiatric symptoms, psychosis, catatonia, complete dissociation, as the psyche fragments entirely, escape into addiction, substances, work, sex, drama, anything to avoid the void, to create temporary sense of substance, to fill the emptiness with something even if it's destroying you. Attempt or complete suicide, not from depression exactly, but from the existential terror of non-existence. If there's no self, what's the point of continuing? Rush into new merger. Immediately find another person to dissolve into, another identity to adopt, restarting the cycle, because the void is unbearable. This is the existential danger Jung warned about. You can lose yourself so completely that retrieval becomes nearly impossible. The self you're trying to recover never actually developed. There's no true self hiding beneath false selves. There's just absence, and facing that absence without immediately filling it requires more psychological strength than most empaths possess. Perhaps the most tragic danger: empaths unconsciously pass this pattern to the next generation. Jung understood that psychological patterns don't die with the individual. They live in the collective unconscious and get transmitted through families, communities, cultures. The empath who never individuates creates an environment where their children cannot individuate either. The mechanisms of transmission, modeling. The child watches the empathic parent disappear themselves, prioritize others' needs, tolerate violation, and they learn, this is what love looks like. This is how you be a good person. Emotional parentification. The empathic parent, drained from other relationships, unconsciously uses the child as their emotional support. The child becomes the parent's therapist, rescuer, mood regulator, boundary violation. The parent's lack of boundaries means they violate the child's boundaries, reading diaries, demanding emotional access, treating the child as an extension of themselves rather than a separate being. Projection. The parent projects their unlived life onto the child, requiring the child to fulfill the parent's abandoned dreams and potential. The result: the child never develops boundaries, never learns they can exist as separate person, never integrates healthy selfishness. They become an empath, and the cycle continues. Jung documented families where boundary dissolution patterns persisted across 3, 4, 5 generations. Great-grandmothers, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, all showing identical patterns of self-abandonment, all believing they were being loving, all unconsciously perpetuating trauma. This is the generational curse. The pattern masquerades as virtue. The child isn't taught to dissolve boundaries through explicit abuse. They're taught through the modeling of love, compassion, and selflessness. They learn that good people sacrifice themselves, that setting boundaries is selfish, that prioritizing your needs means you're not really loving. And they grow up believing these things, teaching them to their own children, creating more empaths who will suffer the same fate. The curse breaks only when someone in the lineage individuates, when someone finally says, "This stops with me." My children will learn that love includes boundaries, that compassion includes self-care, that you can be a good person while existing as a separate being. But that requires what most empaths cannot access: the willingness to be seen as selfish, uncaring, not good enough, at least temporarily, while you build the ego strength you should have developed in childhood. It requires betraying the family legacy, rejecting the model of love you inherited, becoming the bad one who chooses themselves. Most empaths can't do this. The guilt is unbearable, the fear of rejection too intense, the internalized voices too loud. So they remain trapped, and their children become trapped. And the pattern continues. These 5 dangers aren't theoretical. They're the lived reality of empaths who reach middle age without ever having individuated. They're what Jung saw in his clinical work: the devastating consequences of remaining in participation mystique while believing you're being spiritual, loving, evolved. But Jung also offered something else: a solution. A path out of boundary dissolution that doesn't require becoming cold, disconnected, or narcissistic. A way to develop ego strength while maintaining genuine compassion. A process he called individuation, and which represents the empath's only hope for psychological survival. Jung's solution to empath suffering isn't what the spiritual community teaches. It's not energy protection or clearing techniques or shielding practices. It's not learning to manage your sensitivity or honor your gifts. Jung's solution is radical, painful, and often feels like betrayal of everything you've believed about love and goodness. You must develop an ego. You must build psychological boundaries. You must become, for the first time in your life, a separate person. This is the individuation path, not as abstract spiritual concept, but as concrete psychological necessity. Let me show you exactly what Jung prescribed. The first stage is the most counterintuitive for empaths. Before you can help others, before you can love deeply, before you can open to the transpersonal, you must develop a strong ego capable of maintaining boundaries. Jung was explicit about this. The ego is not the enemy. The ego is the necessary container for consciousness. Without a strong ego, opening to others doesn't create connection. It creates dissolution. The work of ego strengthening includes establishing daily rituals that honor your separate existence. This means creating practices that remind your psyche, I am a distinct being with my own rhythms, needs, and boundaries. Morning practice before engaging with anyone else. Sitting in silence and asking, what do I feel? What do I want today? What is my energy before I absorb anyone else's? This creates a baseline, a reference point, a sense of your own state before merger begins. Evening practice of reclamation, before sleep, reviewing the day and identifying, what did I absorb that isn't mine? What can I release? What do I need to acknowledge as my own authentic feeling? Physical practices that ground you in your body. Jung recommended what he called feeling the edges, exercises where you consciously sense your skin, your physical boundaries, the line between you and environment, making decisions based on your needs rather than others' reactions. This is perhaps the most difficult practice for empaths, choosing what you want even when it disappoints others. Starting small, ordering what you actually want at restaurants rather than what's easiest or cheapest or what others suggest. Gradually escalating, choosing how to spend your time based on your desires rather than guilt about others' expectations. Eventually facing the terrifying choices, leaving relationships that require your self-abandonment, pursuing goals that won't please your family, living in ways that violate others' preferences for you. Each choice builds what Jung called ego musculature, the psychological strength to maintain your center against external pressure. Learning to tolerate others' discomfort without absorbing or fixing it. This is the core skill empaths lack. The ability to witness someone's pain, acknowledge it, even care about it, without taking responsibility for it. Jung taught a specific practice. When someone near you is in distress, notice your automatic movement toward fixing, soothing, or absorbing. Stop that movement, stay still. Feel the discomfort of not acting, the guilt, the anxiety, the voice that says you're being selfish or you're not caring enough. Sit with that discomfort until it passes without you collapsing into merger. This gradually teaches your nervous system. Other people's emotions are not emergencies, requiring your immediate intervention, creating physical and psychological space. Empaths typically live in environments with no boundaries, shared spaces, people always present, constant interaction. Ego strengthening requires creating actual physical space that's yours alone. A room with a door that locks, a space where you can close yourself off completely, and psychological space, time where you're unavailable to others, where their needs cannot reach you, where you can exist in complete separation. This feels selfish, cruel even. But Jung would say, it's necessary. The ego develops through experiences of separation, not through constant merger. The second stage addresses why empaths can't maintain boundaries. They've disowned their shadow, particularly their aggression and healthy selfishness. Jung taught that you cannot individuate without integrating your shadow, the rejected, denied, or unlived aspects of yourself. For empaths, the shadow typically contains healthy aggression, the capacity to say no with force, to defend your territory, to push back against violation, to express anger rather than absorbing others' anger. Selfishness, the ability to prioritize your needs over others' wants, to take the last piece of food, to spend money on yourself rather than giving it away, to choose yourself even when others would benefit from your sacrifice. Indifference, the capacity to not care about every suffering person you encounter, to walk past someone in pain without stopping, to let others struggle without intervening. Destructiveness, the parts of you that want to burn it all down, that resent the people you've cared for, that fantasize about freedom through others' absence or death. These qualities terrify empaths because they violate the identity you've built. I'm a good person, I'm caring, I'm compassionate. But Jung would say, these rejected qualities aren't evil. They're necessary for psychological health. Aggression without boundaries becomes abuse. Aggression within boundaries becomes assertion. Selfishness without consciousness becomes narcissism. Selfishness within individuation becomes healthy self-interest. The shadow work requires giving yourself permission to disappoint others. This is perhaps the most liberating and terrifying practice, deliberately saying no to requests, even reasonable ones, just to build your capacity for refusal. Not because you should say no to everything, but because empaths have never developed the neural pathway for "I won't" without collapsing into guilt, expressing anger safely. Empaths have spent lifetimes absorbing others' anger rather than expressing their own. The rage has accumulated but can't be safely expressed toward the people who deserve it. Jung recommended what's now called rage work, physical expressions of anger in safe containers, screaming in your car, hitting pillows, writing letters you never send that express everything you've held back. This begins the integration. Your anger isn't dangerous. It's been dangerous because it's been repressed. Expressed consciously, it becomes life force. Practicing selfish acts deliberately. Each day, do something solely for yourself. Something that benefits no one else. Something that might actively disappoint or inconvenience others. Buy yourself flowers with money you could have given to someone in need. Take a long bath while your partner handles dinner. Pursue a hobby that serves no practical purpose. Journal the guilt and shame that arises. This is your shadow material becoming conscious, acknowledging resentments. Empaths live in perpetual resentment, rage at all the times they gave too much, sacrificed too much, were used too much. But they can never acknowledge it because resentment proves they weren't really being selfless. Jung's shadow work requires brutal honesty. Make a list of everyone you resent and exactly why, not to send to them, to make conscious what's been poisoning you from the unconscious. The third stage involves recognizing that your compulsion to merge with and save others is projection. You're attempting to rescue the abandoned parts of yourself by rescuing them in others. The person you're trying to save is actually you. The woundedness you're trying to heal is actually yours. The development you're facilitating in them is actually your own unlived development. Jung called this projection withdrawal, the difficult work of recognizing that what you see in others is often your own material placed onto them. The process includes recognizing the savior complex. Notice who you're drawn to help. What qualities do they have? What wounds? What potential? Then ask Jung's critical question. What in me am I attempting to heal through healing them? Usually, you're drawn to save people who mirror your own woundedness. You're trying to give them what you never received, provide them what you desperately need, acknowledging that others' journeys are theirs alone. This requires accepting something that feels cruel to empaths. You cannot save anyone. Your love doesn't heal their trauma. Your presence doesn't cure their mental illness. Your sacrifice doesn't transform their lives. Each person must walk their own individuation path. You cannot walk it for them. And attempting to do so actually prevents their development. They never face the crisis that would force their own growth because you're buffering all consequences, redirecting healing energy toward yourself. All that energy you've been directing outward toward fixing, helping, saving others must be redirected inward. Jung was clear. The healing you're compelled to offer others is actually the healing you need to give yourself. What would it look like to rescue yourself? To provide yourself the care you've given others? To prioritize your healing over everyone else's? This feels impossible, selfish, wrong, but it's the only path to genuine helping. You cannot give from depletion. You can only give from overflow. The fourth stage addresses the core issue. Empaths seek wholeness through merger because they're internally incomplete. Jung taught that each person contains both masculine and feminine qualities, what he called animus, inner masculine, and anima, inner feminine. Healthy development requires integrating both, becoming internally whole, no longer requiring external completion. For female empaths, developing your animus, your inner masculine, the capacity for boundaries and limitation, direction and goal setting, assertion and aggression, logical analysis and clear thinking, autonomy and independence. Most female empaths have projected their animus onto male partners, remaining dependent on men for strength, direction, and protection. The integration work requires developing these qualities internally, learning to protect yourself, set your own direction, think clearly without needing male validation. For male empaths, integrating your anima, your inner feminine, the capacity for feeling and emotional depth, receptivity and openness, intuition and non-rational knowing, nurturing and care of self and others, connection to the unconscious. Most male empaths have projected their anima onto female partners, remaining dependent on women for emotional access, feeling, and connection to their inner world. The integration work requires developing these qualities internally, learning to feel your own emotions, access your intuition, nurture yourself without requiring feminine energy from outside. The practices for both: active imagination dialogue with your anima, animus. This is one of Jung's most powerful techniques. Create a dialogue with your inner contrasexual figure. Women, imagine your inner masculine as a figure, a wise man, a warrior, a king, and dialogue with him. Ask him to teach you strength, boundaries, assertion. Men, imagine your inner feminine as a figure, a wise woman, a priestess, a queen, and dialogue with her. Ask her to teach you feeling, receptivity, emotional depth. This gradually builds internal relationship with these qualities rather than requiring external sources. Embodying rejected qualities. Women, practice masculine activities that feel foreign: weightlifting, competitive sports, assertive communication, making demands, taking up physical space. Men, practice feminine activities that feel uncomfortable: expressive movement, emotional journaling, receiving, being cared for rather than caretaking, vulnerability with male friends. The goal isn't to become the opposite gender, it's to reclaim the full spectrum of human qualities within yourself. Ending relationships that require your incompleteness. This is the most difficult aspect, recognizing that some relationships exist because you're incomplete. Your partner provides your missing masculine or feminine qualities. The relationship feels essential because it makes you feel whole, but Jung would say, this isn't love. It's dependency masquerading as love. True love requires two whole individuals. Relationships based on mutual completion must either transform or end. Stage 5. The transcendent function, mature compassion. The final stage is achieving what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one pole or the other. For empaths, this means being both separate and connected, not oscillating between merger and isolation, but maintaining differentiation while remaining in relationship. Being both boundaried and open, not closed off defensively, but able to open consciously to others while maintaining your center. Being both self-interested and compassionate, not choosing between yourself and others, but honoring both your needs and genuine care for others' well-being. This is the goal: mature empathy that doesn't require self-abandonment. The transcendent function develops through practicing conscious opening. Instead of automatic absorption, learning to open to others deliberately, temporarily, while maintaining awareness of your separate center. I'm choosing to feel with you right now, and when this conversation ends, I'll return to my own center. Staying present to paradox. Empaths want resolution. Am I supposed to care about others or care about myself? Be open or have boundaries, give or receive? Jung's answer: both, simultaneously, without resolution. The transcendent function means tolerating this paradox. sitting in the tension without collapsing into either extreme, developing what Jung called the objective psyche. This is the capacity to observe psychological dynamics, your own and others, with some detachment, not cold analysis, but the ability to notice, I'm being pulled into merger right now, I'm feeling their anxiety as my own, I'm losing my center, and then choosing, do I continue opening or do I pull back? Do I engage or do I protect my boundaries? Consciousness creates choice. Unconscious patterns create compulsion, creating relationships of equals, the final manifestation of the transcendent function, relationships where both parties are individuated, where neither needs the other to be whole, where connection emerges from choice rather than desperation, where two complete people consciously decide to remain distinct while deeply relating. Jung called this the true conjunctio, the sacred marriage of two individuated selves, not the pathological merger empaths have experienced as deep connection, but the conscious union of two people who could be whole alone but choose to be together. This five-stage path is the empath's journey from pathological fusion to psychological differentiation. It's not quick. Most people require years of intensive work to complete these stages. It's not comfortable. Every stage requires betraying familiar patterns and tolerating overwhelming guilt, fear, and uncertainty, but it's the only path to genuine empathy, the kind that emerges from wholeness rather than woundedness, the kind that serves others without destroying yourself, the kind Jung embodied and taught. Now let's look at historical examples of both failure and success on this path. History provides us with clear examples of what happens when empaths fail to individuate, and what becomes possible when they succeed. Let's examine the catastrophic failures and the remarkable successes. Sylvia Plath's life and death demonstrate empath identity carried to its tragic conclusion. Her poetry and journals document, with devastating precision, the progressive dissolution of self through psychological merger with Ted Hughes. When Plath met Hughes in 1956, she experienced what she called recognition, the feeling that she'd found her other half, the person who would complete her, the masculine force that would give her formless feminine energy, direction, and substance. In Jungian terms, she immediately projected her entire animus onto him. Her journals from this period reveal the mechanism clearly. He is a genius. He is strong where I am weak. He knows what he wants while I flounder. His poetry is powerful while mine is delicate and uncertain. She wasn't describing an actual person. She was describing her own unlived masculine qualities that she needed to develop internally, but instead sought externally through merger. Within months of marriage, Plath had abandoned her own creative development to serve as Hughes's typist, editor, and domestic support. She typed his manuscripts, submitted his work to publishers, managed household duties, and subordinated her own writing to his schedule. Her journals show increasing confusion about her own voice. When I write, I hear his rhythms. When I think his thoughts. Where does he end and I begin? By their third year of marriage, Plath's poetry had begun to lose its distinct voice. Critics noted she was writing in Hughes's style, his imagery, his dark mythological symbolism, his aggressive masculine energy. She wasn't imitating him consciously. She was disappearing into him. The turning point came when Hughes began an affair. Plath's response is telling. She didn't just feel betrayed. She felt erased. Her journals from this period: if he doesn't love me, I don't exist. If his attention goes to another woman, where do I go? I am nothing without him. I have no substance of my own. This isn't healthy heartbreak. This is ego dissolution through failed merger. Plath had built her entire sense of self on psychological fusion with Hughes. When that fusion broke, there was no separate Sylvia to fall back on. There was just void. Her final poems, the aerial sequence written in the months before her suicide, are extraordinary works of art. But they're also documents of complete psychological fragmentation. She writes about disappearing, about becoming nothing, about the self as a mere zero or erasure. She writes about eggs hatching, wanting to be born but having no form to be born into. Jung would recognize these as descriptions of someone whose ego never fully formed, whose sense of separate self was always provisional, always dependent on merger with a stronger psychological force. When Hughes left, Plath attempted to survive alone, but she had no practice being alone, no experience existing as a separate person, no internal masculine to provide structure and direction. She became what Jung called psychologically dismembered, fragments of self with no organizing center. At 30 years old, with 2 small children, during one of London's coldest winters, Sylvia Plath sealed the kitchen, turned on the gas, and killed herself. The tragedy isn't that she was too sensitive for this world. The tragedy is that she never individuated. She remained in participation mystique from childhood, with her own domineering father, then after his death, with her possessive mother, through adulthood, with Hughes. She never developed the psychological structure that would have allowed her to survive merger's end. Her extraordinary sensitivity, her empathic attunement, her capacity to feel everything, these weren't gifts. They were compensations for catastrophic ego weakness. And when the person she'd merged with withdrew, she had nothing to return to. Because there was no Sylvia Plath beneath the merger. There was only absorbed identity, projected animus, and void. Carl Rogers offers the contrasting example, a man who developed what Jung would call mature empathy through successful individuation. Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy, became famous for his concept of unconditional positive regard, the capacity to accept and care for clients completely without judgment, without merging, without losing himself. His therapeutic approach demonstrated precisely what individuated empathy looks like. He could enter clients' psychological worlds completely, could feel what they felt, see through their eyes, experience their reality from the inside. But he never lost track of who he was, never absorbed their pathology, never carried their pain home. After sessions, Rogers would describe feeling cleansed, returned to his own center, his own clarity, his own separate existence. This wasn't coldness, it was differentiation. The key to Rogers's capacity, he'd undergone his own individuation journey. Early in his career, Rogers struggled with exactly the patterns we've discussed. He would absorb clients' depression, take on their anxiety, lose sleep worrying about their well-being. He described one particularly difficult case where he became so enmeshed with a psychotic client that he began experiencing dissociative symptoms himself, questioning his own reality, feeling her delusions as if they were his own perceptions. This crisis forced Rogers into his own therapy and intensive self-examination. He had to learn what Jung taught. Opening to others without adequate ego strength isn't therapeutic, it's dangerous to both parties. Rogers spent years developing what he called internal locus of evaluation, a stable internal sense of self that didn't require external validation or merge with external psychological fields. He practiced daily meditation, maintained strong boundaries around his work hours, cultivated relationships outside therapy where he could receive support rather than always giving it. He integrated his shadow, particularly his own need to be needed, his inflation around being the good helper, his unconscious use of therapeutic relationships to avoid his own loneliness. Most importantly, Rogers developed his anima, his capacity for feeling and receptivity internally rather than requiring it from clients. He wasn't receiving emotional nourishment from therapy relationships. He was giving from overflow. The result was revolutionary. Rogers could offer profound empathy, deep attunement, genuine unconditional positive regard, all while maintaining absolute psychological separation. His clients felt completely seen and accepted, but they never felt merged with him. They experienced him as a clear mirror reflecting their own reality back to them, not as someone absorbing and carrying their content. This is differentiated empathy, the capacity to be with someone in their pain without making their pain yours. Rogers wrote extensively about this distinction. I can enter your world, walk around in it, feel what you feel, and then return to my own world when our time together ends. Your pain touches me but doesn't wound me. Your struggle moves me but doesn't exhaust me. Jung would recognize this as the transcendent function in action, both separate and connected simultaneously. Rogers's personal life reflected this same integration. He had a long, stable marriage where both he and his wife maintained their own identities, interests, and psychological boundaries while remaining deeply connected. He described their relationship as two distinct people who choose each other daily rather than two halves of one whole. He wrote about the importance of time apart, of individual development, of each partner maintaining their own center while coming together consciously. This is what healthy relating looks like after individuation: connection without dissolution, intimacy without merger, love without self-abandonment. Jung's own life provides a complex but instructive example of differentiated relating, though ethically problematic. For over 40 years, Jung maintained simultaneous relationships with his wife Emma and his colleague lover Tony Wolff. From a conventional perspective, this looks like betrayal, narcissism, or Jung's own shadow possession. But from a strictly psychological perspective, setting aside the ethical issues, Jung's navigation of this triangle demonstrates the capacity to remain psychologically separate while deeply relating to multiple people. Jung didn't merge with either woman. He didn't lose himself in either relationship. He didn't require either woman to complete him or provide his missing qualities. Emma represented his connection to conventional life, family, social respectability, practical reality. Tony represented his connection to the unconscious, psychological exploration, mystical depth, creative work. Jung integrated both aspects internally rather than requiring external provision of either. He writes in his autobiography about the importance of not merging, even with people you love deeply. I learned that I must remain myself in all relationships. To dissolve into another, even in the name of love, is to betray both yourself and them. Jung maintained his own center, his own work, his own psychological development through both relationships. Neither woman completed him. He related to both from a place of wholeness rather than need. Again, this is not an endorsement of Jung's relational choices. The ethical problems are significant, and both women suffered from the arrangement, but it demonstrates the psychological principle. When you've individuated, you can be deeply connected to others without losing yourself in them. You can remain a distinct being while opening to intimate relating. The contrast with Plath is instructive. Plath merged completely with Hughes and dissolved when the merger ended. Jung remained separate from both Emma and Tony, and when Tony eventually died, Jung grieved deeply but continued his own development without fracturing. The difference is ego strength developed through individuation. Vincent van Gogh offers another cautionary tale of empath sensitivity without adequate psychological structure. Van Gogh's letters reveal extraordinary empathic capacity. He could feel the suffering of the poor, the pain of the natural world, the emotional resonance of colors and forms. His art emerged from this empathic attunement. His paintings pulse with absorbed emotion, particularly in his final years when he painted with what he called terrible lucidity. seeing and feeling everything with overwhelming intensity. But Van Gogh had no container for what he felt. He describes in letters to his brother Theo the experience of walking through town and being overwhelmed by others' suffering, of feeling physical pain when seeing mistreated animals or exploited workers, of experiencing color so intensely that it hurt him. This wasn't spiritual advancement. It was boundary dissolution without adequate ego strength. Van Gogh's increasingly frequent psychotic breaks were manifestations of this porosity. He would absorb so much emotional content that his psyche couldn't process it, leading to complete overwhelm, dissociation, and eventually self-harm. The famous ear-cutting incident came after an argument with Gauguin. Van Gogh had merged so completely with Gauguin's presence that when Gauguin left, Van Gogh experienced it as self-mutilation. He was cutting away the part of himself that had become Gauguin. Jung would see Van Gogh as someone with enormous empathic and creative gifts, but catastrophically weak ego boundaries. If Van Gogh had undergone the individuation work, strengthening his ego, integrating his shadow, developing internal wholeness, he might have channeled his sensitivity into art without being destroyed by it. But he never learned to maintain his own center while opening to the world's pain. So the pain overwhelmed him completely. At 37, after years of psychological suffering, Van Gogh shot himself in the chest and died. Another tragedy of sensitivity without structure. These historical examples reveal the consistent pattern Jung identified. Empath sensitivity without individuation leads to psychological destruction, either through suicide, Plath, Van Gogh, through dissolution into others, which is a form of psychological death, or through chronic suffering and illness. Empath sensitivity with individuation leads to mature compassion, the capacity to be deeply present to others' pain while maintaining your own center. Rogers demonstrated this. Jung, despite his ethical failures, demonstrated this. Many successful therapists, healers, and caregivers who maintain healthy lives and relationships demonstrate this. The difference isn't the degree of sensitivity, it's the presence or absence of psychological structure to contain the sensitivity. You can be extraordinarily empathic and healthy if you've individuated. You cannot be empathic and healthy if you remain in participation, mystique. This is Jung's clear message through both his clinical work and his own life. Individuation isn't optional for empaths. It's the difference between psychological survival and annihilation. Jung's credibility on empath issues comes from direct experience. He wasn't theorizing about boundary dissolution from safe distance. He lived it, nearly died from it, and emerged with hard-won wisdom. Let me show you Jung's own descent into participation mystique and how he found his way back. Jung's empath patterns began in childhood with his mother, Emily Jung. Emily exhibited what Jung later described as a split personality, two completely distinct personas that would alternate unpredictably. Personality number one, the conventional pastor's wife, proper domestic, cheerful in public, maintaining social appearances. Personality number two, the uncanny mystic, dark, prophetic, speaking truths no one wanted to hear, connecting to unconscious material in ways that terrified the family. Young Carl never knew which mother he would encounter. He describes in his autobiography the constant vigilance required, scanning her face, reading her energy, trying to predict which personality was present before interacting with her. This is the origin of empath hypervigilance, the child who must constantly read and adjust to a parent's unpredictable states develops extraordinary perceptual abilities at the cost of their own development. Jung learned to shapeshift, to become cheerful and conventional when his mother was in personality number one, to become deep and mystical when she was in personality number two. He learned to merge with whichever mother was present, because failing to match her state triggered unpredictable consequences. But here's what Jung recognized later. In becoming expert at merging with her shifting states, he never developed a stable center of his own. His own personality began to split similarly. He describes experiencing himself as two people. Personality number one, the conventional student and son, and personality number two, the connection to something vast and unknowable. This wasn't healthy multiplicity. It was fragmentation resulting from never having permission to be consistently himself. Jung's relationship with his mother taught him participation mystique from infancy, and it nearly destroyed him. The crisis came in 1913 after Jung's break with Freud. Jung describes the experience as feeling the ground literally give way beneath my feet, and I fell down into dark depths. What followed was 3 years of what Jung called confrontation with the unconscious, a period modern psychiatry would likely diagnose as psychotic break. Jung experienced overwhelming visions that felt more real than physical reality. Archetypal figures, Elijah, Salome, Philemon, appearing and speaking with such vividness that Jung couldn't distinguish them from actual people. Loss of ego boundaries, times when he couldn't tell where his consciousness ended and the visions began. Moments when he wasn't sure if he was Jung experiencing visions or one of the archetypal figures experiencing Jung. Absorption of collective content. Jung describes feeling as if he was experiencing the psyche of all humanity, particularly the collective grief and rage that would soon explode into World War I. Physical symptoms, pressure in his head, sensation of choking, inability to maintain normal activities, periods where he could barely function in his role as father and husband. This was participation mystique turned inward, Jung's consciousness dissolving not into another person, but into the collective unconscious itself, and it was terrifying. Jung writes about moments when he genuinely didn't know if he would survive psychologically, when he considered that he might go completely insane, lose himself permanently in the archetypal depths. The experience taught him viscerally what he would later teach empaths. Opening to the transpersonal without adequate ego strength is catastrophic. What saved Jung was discovering a method of engaging the unconscious while maintaining ego consciousness. He began what he later called active imagination, deliberately entering the visionary states, dialoguing with the archetypal figures but maintaining a position of observer even while participating. The Red Book documents this process, page after page of Jung recording his visions, his conversations with inner figures, his attempts to understand the overwhelming material erupting from his unconscious. The key was that Jung was recording, writing, creating. This meant his ego remained active even when the unconscious was flooding consciousness. He maintained the position of witness even while being overwhelmed by what he witnessed. Jung later taught this as the essential technique for empaths. You can open to overwhelming content if you maintain a conscious witness position. You can feel everything if some part of you remains capable of saying, "I am feeling this," rather than completely becoming the feeling. The Red Book period gradually strengthened Jung's ego through repeated practice, opening to the unconscious, nearly being consumed by it, pulling back to the witness position, recording what happened. Each cycle built psychological musculature. By 1916, Jung emerged from the worst of the crisis. The visions continued but no longer threatened his sanity. He'd developed the container strong enough to hold them. Jung's confrontation with the unconscious taught him that ego strength and boundaries aren't defenses against spirituality. They're essential containers without which the transpersonal destroys the personal. Before the crisis, Jung had somewhat romanticized ego dissolution. He'd been drawn to mystical experiences, to losing himself in archetypal depths, to transcending the limitations of personal identity. The crisis showed him the danger in that romance. Complete ego dissolution doesn't lead to enlightenment. It leads to psychosis. Opening to the collective unconscious without a strong ego doesn't create spiritual wisdom. It creates madness. Jung emerged teaching empaths the lesson he'd learned through nearly losing his sanity. You must build a strong ego before you can safely open to the transpersonal. You must develop solid boundaries before you can consciously dissolve them. You must know who you are as a separate self before you can safely experience merger with the collective. This contradicted, and still contradicts, most spiritual teaching, which treats the ego as the enemy to be overcome. But Jung knew, the ego isn't the enemy. The weak, fragmented, undeveloped ego is the problem. A strong, integrated ego doesn't prevent spiritual experience. It makes spiritual experience sustainable rather than destructive. Jung's struggles with boundary dissolution didn't end with the Red Book period. Throughout his career, he documented what he called psychic infections from patients, experiences of absorbing their psychological content, experiencing their symptoms, taking on their complexes. One case particularly affected him, a woman with severe paranoid delusions. After months of working with her, Jung began experiencing paranoid thoughts himself. He would enter his home and feel convinced someone had been there, moving his belongings. He would wake at night certain someone was watching him. He began checking doors obsessively. The symptoms mystified him until he realized these weren't his paranoid thoughts. They were absorbed from his patient. Once he recognized this, Jung had to learn what he later called psychological hygiene, deliberate practices to cleanse himself after sessions, to return absorbed material to its source, to reclaim his own psychological center. The practices he developed: post-session cleansing rituals. Jung would take walks after difficult sessions, consciously releasing absorbed content. He described visualizing the patient's material leaving his psyche and returning to them. Physical practices to ground in separate self. Chopping wood became one of Jung's primary practices, something concrete, physical, distinctly his own, that reminded his body and psyche of separate existence, time in nature away from people. Jung built Bullingen Tower specifically as a place where he could retreat from human contact, where his psyche could recover its own rhythms without absorbing others' fields, limiting his practice hours. Unlike many analysts who saw patients 8 or more hours daily, Jung deliberately limited his practice to allow recovery time between sessions. These weren't luxuries, they were necessities. Jung had learned that his own empathic sensitivity, his capacity to feel into patients' psychological worlds, would destroy him if not balanced with strong boundaries and regular cleansing practices. Jung's relationship with Toni Wolff taught him another critical lesson about maintaining boundaries even in intimate relating. Toni was herself a powerful psychologist with deep connections to the unconscious. When they met, both experienced intense psychological recognition. The danger was merger. Jung describes the early period of their relationship as two people who could have easily dissolved into each other, losing both individualities in the process. The intensity of their connection, the depth of their mutual understanding, the shared immersion in psychological exploration, all created conditions for participation mystique. But Jung had learned from his psychotic break, merger, however attractive, leads to destruction. So he deliberately maintained separation, even in the midst of profound intimacy. He insisted on separate living spaces, separate practices, separate domains of authority in their work. He maintained his family life with Emma, even while deepening his connection with Toni. He refused to make Toni his everything, refused to project his anima completely onto her, refused to require her to complete him. This wasn't coldness, it was consciousness. Jung loved Tony deeply, but he wouldn't dissolve into her. He remained Jung even while opening to profound relating. Years later, when Tony died, Jung grieved intensely, but he didn't fragment, didn't lose himself, continued his work and his development because his identity hadn't been based on merger with her. He'd maintained his separate center throughout their decades together. This taught Jung that love and differentiation aren't opposites, that you can be profoundly connected while remaining distinct, that the deepest intimacy doesn't require self-abandonment. Jung's personal struggles with boundary dissolution led to his most emphatic teaching about empaths. You must individuate, not as optional spiritual practice, but as psychological necessity. Opening to others without individuation is slow suicide. Absorbing the collective unconscious without ego strength is rapid suicide. Jung had seen this in his patients, the sensitive ones who dissolved into others and ended up in psychiatric wards or dead by their own hand. He'd nearly experienced it himself during the Red Book period, and he'd learned the hard way that the only solution is building the psychological structure that should have developed in childhood but didn't. For empaths, this means developing ego strength even though it feels selfish, because without ego strength, your sensitivity will destroy you. Building boundaries even though it feels cruel, because without boundaries, you'll absorb content you cannot process. Integrating shadow even though it violates your identity as good person, because without shadow integration, you'll carry everyone else's darkness until it poisons you. Individuating even though it means betraying the family legacy of self-sacrifice, because remaining in participation mystique means psychological death. Jung's gift to empaths is this hard-won wisdom. Your sensitivity is not the problem. Your lack of container for the sensitivity is the problem. And building that container through individuation is not optional. It's survival. Now let's turn to the practical tools Jung developed for exactly this work. Theory is useless without practice. Jung's genius wasn't just in understanding empath suffering, it was in developing concrete tools for transformation. These aren't abstract psychological concepts. They're daily practices that build the ego strength, boundaries, and differentiation empaths need to survive. Let me give you the exact exercises Jung prescribed. This is the foundation, a 15-minute morning practice that creates a baseline of your authentic state before merger begins. Upon waking, before checking messages, before engaging with anyone, before absorbing any external content, sit in silence and ask 3 questions. What do I feel right now? Not what you think you should feel, not what would be appropriate to feel. What you actually feel in this moment before you've absorbed anything from anyone. Sad, peaceful, anxious, numb, angry, content, name it. Even if it's I don't know or nothing, that's still data. What do I want today? Not what others need from you, not what you should want. What you want, to rest, to create, to connect, to be alone, to accomplish, to play. Even small wants matter. The practice is reconnecting to desire that originates from your own center. What is my energy before I absorb anyone else's? Scan your body. Notice your energy level, your mood, your state. This becomes your reference point for the day. When your energy shifts dramatically, you can compare. Is this shift coming from me, or have I absorbed someone else's state? Write these responses. The act of writing reinforces that this is your experience, not absorbed content. It creates evidence of your separate existence. Practice feeling your physical edges. Still sitting, bring awareness to your skin, the boundary between you and environment. Feel your feet on the floor, your sitting bones on the chair, the air on your face. This grounds consciousness in your separate body, your distinct physical existence. Jung taught this because empaths live primarily in the psychic realm, losing connection to physical boundaries. The body knows what the mind forgets. You end here. Others begin there. There's space between. Why this works? This ritual creates what Jung called ego consciousness before contamination, a clear sense of your own state before the day's absorptions begin. It trains your psyche to recognize, this is me. This is my starting point. Anything different from this may be absorbed. Over time, this builds the neural pathway of checking in with yourself, of maintaining connection to your own center, even as you engage with others. This is real-time boundary maintenance, learning to distinguish between your emotional content and absorbed emotional content. When you notice an emotional shift, pause. Don't just experience the emotion. Notice that you're experiencing it. Create a moment of conscious observation. An emotional shift just occurred. Ask Jung's critical question, is this mine or am I absorbing someone else's emotional content? How to tell, is this emotion consistent with your own circumstances? If you were feeling peaceful and suddenly you're anxious, but nothing changed in your actual situation, likely absorbed. Did the shift correlate with proximity to another person? If you felt fine alone, then someone called, texted, entered the room, and now you feel different, likely absorbed. Does this emotional intensity match the stimulus? If you feel overwhelming grief over a minor disappointment, likely you're feeling someone else's accumulated grief that has nothing to do with the current situation. If it's absorbed, use Jung's visualization. Imagine the emotion as a colored mist you've been breathing in. Now breathe it out. Visualize it leaving your body and returning to its source. Say internally or aloud, this is not mine. I return this to its source with compassion. Then drop into your body. Feel your feet, your breath, your physical boundaries. Ask, what do I actually feel beneath this absorbed material? Often you'll discover a completely different emotion underneath. You thought you were anxious, but you were absorbing someone else's anxiety. Underneath, you're actually frustrated, or tired, or peaceful. If it's yours, acknowledge it. Name it. This is my anger, or this is my grief. Feel it fully without rushing to process or fix it. Ask, what is this emotion telling me? What do I need? Why this works. This practice builds the neural pathway for self-other distinction that should have developed in childhood but didn't. Each time you correctly identify absorbed content and return it, you strengthen your psychological boundaries. Each time you correctly identify your own content and honor it, you strengthen your connection to authentic self. Over time, the differentiation becomes more automatic. You develop an internal alarm that signals, this doesn't feel like mine. This practice systematically integrates the disowned shadow qualities that prevent boundary maintenance. Each day, deliberately do one selfish act, not actually harmful or cruel. Selfish, from the empath's distorted perspective, meaning prioritizing yourself over others' comfort. Examples: say no to a request without explaining or justifying. Take the last piece of food without asking if anyone else wants it. Spend money on yourself instead of on someone else. Cancel plans because you'd rather rest, not because you're sick. Let someone struggle with their problem without offering to fix it. Do something you enjoy while others need your help. Prioritize your preference when someone asks, what do you want to do? Immediately after the selfish act, journal. What am I feeling? Usually guilt, shame, anxiety, fear. What thoughts are arising? I'm a bad person. They'll hate me. I'm being cruel. I should have. What am I afraid will happen? Abandonment, rejection, punishment, others' suffering. What part of me believes selfishness is dangerous? Usually, the child part that learned self-prioritization triggered parents' rage or withdrawal. Then write, what if prioritizing myself is actually healthy? What if saying no is actually loving to myself and others? What if I'm allowed to exist as a separate being with my own needs? Why this works? Empaths have completely disowned healthy self-interest. It lives in the shadow as dangerous or bad. But you cannot individuate without integrating your capacity for self-prioritization. This practice doesn't make you narcissistic. It brings you toward center, from pathological selflessness toward balanced self-care. Each selfish act you survive without catastrophe weakens the unconscious belief that boundaries equal death. Over time, you build new neural pathways. I can prioritize myself and still be loved. I can say no and still be safe. I can exist as separate and not be abandoned. This is one of Jung's most powerful techniques, dialoguing with your inner contrasexual archetype to develop internal wholeness. Set aside 20-30 minutes in a quiet space. For women, developing animus inner masculine. Close your eyes and imagine a masculine figure appearing. Don't force a specific image. Let him emerge from your unconscious. He might be a wise old man, a warrior, a king, a protective father figure, or something unexpected. When the figure feels present, begin dialogue. You. Who are you? What quality do you represent for me? Listen for the response. It may come as words, images, feelings, or knowing. You. I've been seeking strength, boundaries, and direction in men outside myself. Can you teach me to find these qualities within? Listen to his guidance. You. What do I need to do to embody you, to access masculine qualities without requiring external men to provide them? The conversation continues naturally. You ask questions, he responds. Write it all down afterward. For men, integrating anima, inner feminine. Follow the same process, but invite a feminine figure. She might be a wise old woman, a priestess, a queen, a nurturing mother figure. You. Who are you? What quality do you represent? You. I've been seeking emotional depth, feeling, and receptivity in women outside myself. Can you teach me to access these qualities within? You. How do I embody you? How do I feel deeply, connect to my emotions, open to vulnerability without requiring women to carry these qualities for me? Practice this weekly. The relationship with your anima as animus deepens over time. You'll receive guidance, challenges, teachings. Gradually you internalize these qualities. Women develop internal masculine strength. Men develop internal feminine receptivity. You stop requiring external completion. You become whole within yourself. Why this works? Jung discovered that we contain both masculine and feminine qualities, but socialization and trauma cause us to disown one and project it onto others. Empaths require merger because they're internally incomplete, missing masculine or feminine qualities they seek in partners. Active imagination rebuilds the internal relationship with these qualities, making external merger unnecessary. You can then relate to others from wholeness rather than need. This systematic practice withdraws projections and disentangles from merger. Once weekly, make a list. Write every person you're currently emotionally entangled with. Partners, family members, close friends, even clients or co-workers if applicable. For each person, identify 3 ways you've absorbed their content. Examples: I'm carrying Mom's anxiety about my life choices. I've adopted Jake's political beliefs without examining if I actually agree. I'm experiencing Sarah's depression as my own. I've taken on Tom's anger at his father as anger at male authority. Next to each absorption, write, this is not mine. Be specific. Mom's anxiety about my life is not mine. I return it to her with compassion. Then visualize cutting cords. Imagine energetic cords connecting you to each person. See yourself taking scissors and cutting each cord. This doesn't mean ending the relationship. It means ending the unconscious merger. You can remain connected while being separate. Finally, reclaim your energy. Visualize all the energy you've been directing toward these people returning to you. See it flowing back into your own center. Feel yourself becoming more full, more present, more substantial. Why this works? Jung taught that what we call energy is really psychological libido, the psychic force that animates consciousness. Empaths direct most of their libido outward toward others. They're depleted because their energy is scattered across multiple people and situations. This practice consciously withdraws libido from external objects and returns it to the self. Over time, you have more energy, clearer boundaries, stronger sense of separate existence. This daily visualization builds the internal sense of being a boundaried self. Sit comfortably and close your eyes. Visualize yourself as a strong, sealed container. Jung used the image of a clay vessel that's been fired in a kiln, impermeable, solid, capable of holding contents without leaking. Your container might be different: a crystal sphere, a stone fortress, a woven basket, a clay pot. Let the image emerge naturally.